Chapter 1506. Cheers could be heard from afar from time to time. 3 seven-headed lizards were attacking the rebel army's camp at the foot of the mountain. These gigantic creatures had their chests above the canopy of the trees. When they picked up the rebel soldiers and threw them into the air, their heads were as tall as spruce. The seven-headed lizards were covered in armor, even their heads were covered in spiked helmets. Below them were layers of chain armor that protected their long necks. The soft arrows and spears of the rebel soldiers had no effect on them at all. They charged forward and broke through the camp. The wooden walls creaked under the impact and cracked inch by inch. A row of iron men in the camp came forward and were flattened by a single stomp. Facing such a monster, the psychological defense of the rebels finally collapsed. After a scream, they turned around and fled. The Knight of the White Lion Guard saw the grade 4 creatures made by the craftsmen being slapped like paper. They could not help but click their tongues. Although they knew about the existence of these snake lizard beasts in Valhalla, they did not expect them to be so powerful. Could it be that Miss Monica was very careful with these treasures? Dozens of gargoyles rose into the air, and under the command of a wind elemental djinn, they flew toward the snake lizard beasts. However, the snake lizard beasts moved their torsos under the command of the beast tamer, revealing a 2-story tower on their backs. On the tower, the tree elf archers were holding silver longbows, and rows of figures stood elegantly behind the parapet. They drew their bows, and the creaking sound of the bows rang through the forest. Draw your bows. Release. A rain of black arrows flew out like a wall rising in the air, and swept across like a hurricane. In the blink of an eye, more than half of the gargoyles withered, leaving only the djinn roaring violently in the air. Thunder and lightning roared in its cloud-like body. However, the commander on the tower had already noticed this lone commander, and a black flag was raised. The elves changed their target and began to shoot at the rebels who were fleeing below, because physical attacks did almost no damage to the incorporeal elemental creatures. The ones who attacked were the druids. Beams of flame arrows flew out from the tower and hit the wind elemental, causing it to howl in pain. The djinn of wind elemental had once formed an alliance with the Bugas, so the grey wizards of the Sassalds naturally could not ignore their allies being attacked. They rose from the forest one after another, trying to stop these giant beasts. However, before they could attack, rows of silver figures descended from the clouds. They were the Valkyrie. They rode on the raging flame heavenly horse and held silver spears and scimitars in their hands as they charged towards the battlefield. The Valkyrie from Tanajul had arrived and joined the Valkyrie led by Brunhilde. The number of Valkyries had increased significantly, almost forming a sizable force. Ever since the restoration of the Cloud Gate, Valhalla had begun to summon Valkyrie on a small scale. Seeing these Valkyries, the young knight of the White Lion Guards could not help but cheer again. Although they were now dressed in rags and looked like a group of beggars with their arms around each other's shoulders, this did not hinder the enthusiasm and excitement in their hearts. These Valkyries had been their greatest support these days. If not for them holding back the Sassalds' grey wizards, they would have been burned to ashes by magic. The grey wizards and the Valkyries were old rivals, and the fighting strength of the two sides was about the same. It was obvious that it would be difficult to determine the winner in a short time. However, after the rebels lost their greatest support on the battlefield, defeat was only a matter of time. Of course, to the people of Tanajul this was no longer important. Compared to the battle in Menta, this was just a small matter. The results of a few thousand noble rebels were not even worth mentioning. After Brando left Princess Griffine's tent, he went to find Freya. The Valkyrie of Erwin was sitting alone on a rock in a daze, not paying attention to the battle below. When Brando found her, she was startled and hurriedly wiped away her tears, jumping down from the rock with a red face. You didn't see anything, did you? Freya asked with a red face. Didn't I see it in the tent already? This answer was naturally met with a fierce glare. Freya hesitated for a moment. Thinking of Amandina, she felt a little guilty. Brando, I didn't protect Miss Amandina well. I'm sorry Brando shook his head. Your opponent is the Sassalds. We've already done well this time. If you really want to apologize, go and say it to Amandina in person. What? Brando looked at the battle in the distance. He withdrew his gaze and said, Let's go, we'll go and rescue Amandina now. Freya's eyes widened in disbelief. She pointed at her chest. I'm going too? What, you don't want to go? Brando smiled. You lost her, so naturally you'll be the one to find her. I'll take you along. Freya felt her heart fill with warmth, but she could not say anything. She could only look at him gently, using her eyes to express her thoughts. It was gratitude and gratitude. Of course it was not just this time. I'm sorry, Brando. She suddenly said with an apologetic tone. Brando was stunned. What, didn't I say you don't need to be sorry? It's not that, Freya blushed a little, it's because of some things in the past. What things? Freya just shook her head and pretended to be mute. That seemed like a long time ago. There were only memories left in her heart. I want to find my parents. My uncle and aunt said that when I grow up they will tell me who they are. They said that my father is a knight, a great person like Sir Everton. One day I will also become a knight. The Roman people naturally want to become merchants, because merchants can earn a lot of money, so much that my aunt and I will never be able to spend it all. What about you, Brando? Me? I don't know, but I don't want to learn any swordsmanship. I want my grandfather to understand that the truly powerful things in this world are not swords. One day, if I have the ability to do so, I will make sure that Aween will never be disturbed by the flames of war, so that its people can live a peaceful life without swords, and not live in fear every day like they are now. How is that possible? The undead are so terrifying, how can they let us go? Brando, how do you plan to deal with the undead? I haven't thought about it yet, but I have a feeling that I have seen that world in my dreams. If it exists, I will definitely find it. She stood in front of the young boy and girl and asked them, Brando, Mr. Martin is the chief swordsman instructor of Fortress Reedon, and he is a truly capable person. I am going to join the militia and Breton will be going as well. Don't you want to protect the others? Come with us. The young boy shook his head. I might have to go back to Bragg's for a while. Let's talk about it when we have the chance. My father wants me to inherit his mill, and he said in the letter that my grandfather's health is getting worse, and he might want to see me. She was a little disappointed, but there were some things that she did not ask. What about you, Roman? I will wait for Brando to come back. If he is going to join the militia, I will go as well. The young girl nodded and turned to leave. 7 years had passed since then. When they met again, it was already the summer of the year of blooming flowers. And that summer night, the stars in the sky were especially bright. The two of them walked side by side in the camp. Freya secretly looked at Brando, who was beside her. So he never forgot what she said at that time. She always knew that she was Roman and she was the stupidest person. But why did he choose this path? Mr. Martin said that his path was different from ours. So Mr. Martin had already noticed something. Did he know that Brando was the descendant of the sword Saint Darius from the beginning? Freya thought silently. Have you already activated your elemental activation? Freya, can you fly? Freya came back to her senses and looked at Brando's hand that was stretched out to her. Yes, she nodded. Andrea and the others taught me. Then take my hand. She reached out her hand, hesitated for a moment, and then put it in the warm palm of her hand. At this moment, his restless heart surprisingly calmed down. Rows of seats, religious-style reliefs, 12 layers of columns going up one by one, supporting layers of arches immersed in the darkness. 170 stone statues watched the noisy hall from the shadows. At the top of the vault, the final battle between the Azure Knight and the Twilight Dragon was painted. The heroes of the gods and the destruction of the world were painted in green and red paint, each occupying half of the mural, and the skylight was projected from the central hole. A beam of white light passed through the darkness, and the long circular table in the center of the hall was suddenly carved out of the darkness. The people of Fanzan, Cruz, the Wind Elves, the representatives of the Silver Bay States, the Bugas, and the Druids each occupied an area, followed by the representatives of the White City States and the Barbarians. In the center of the long circular table was the master of the place, the elemental tyrant of the Myrna people in a red robe. Tumen, Mephistopheles, and Andrique were divided on the left and right of the old man. Next to the three of them was Greysword Mephisto, who was looking at the area where the representatives of Cruz were. It was more than half empty at the moment, and only a few people from the military were sitting there, including Mangrove, Duke Ludwig, and Veronica. The elves had not arrived yet, and there were only a few guards in the Saint Tossol seat. The elven girls were whispering to each other with longbows on their backs. The Silver Alliance's area was almost empty, and there were only a few people left. Most of the wizards had left Babel Fortress, and only a few apprentices were left, and they did not speak to any suggestions. A taciturn elder sat in the druid's seat, proving the existence of the Ring of Skies. Although the area of the Silver Bay States was bustling with people, there were not many who had the right to speak. A considerable number of these people were asking about the wilderness of 4 territories, and why the Silver Bay Coalition army had not yet arrived in Alcash. As for the barbarians, most of them were the mountain people who had fled the Latch of Wa and the Highlanders of Anzaruta. They rarely sent a representative, but they rarely expressed their opinions. Finally, there were the representatives of Fanzan and the White City States. The former mainly consisted of the members of the Fanzan Royal Knights and the Air Knight Regiment, who had been ordered by the Pope to come as reinforcements. The latter were basically just there to make up the numbers, except for the faraway Eagle Adventurers Guild who had sent over 300 mercenaries to help. After all, the Fanzan and the Wild Elves of Atlantis still had to deal with the threat of the Great Glacier Race and the Horned Beetles from the east. The decision on whether to evacuate Babel Fortress was in fact mainly based on the opinions of the Wind Elves and Cruise People. However, the sudden absence of the Cruise People and the Wind Elves before the meeting made most people feel puzzled. For a while there was a lot of discussion in the hall, and the buzzing sound of discussion echoed. Almost all of the main representatives of Saint Tassol were not present, and the elven guards who were responsible for maintaining order naturally did not participate in this high-level meeting. On the other hand, there was a serious dispute within the military on the Cruise side. Veronica was adamant that they should not evacuate the fortress. Her insistence was not without reason. After leaving the Alcash area, the Crystal Legion army could attack the entire wilderness of 4 territories from the Alcash Mountains. After that, there were thousands of miles of plains and there was no way to defend. After that, they would have to retreat to the ancient Twilight Forest and rely on the White Mountain and the Autumn Twilight Mountains for defense. Although the ancient forest was the natural border of Saint Tassol, it was hard to say how useful it would be for the Crystal Legion army. More importantly, the conditions there were not necessarily better than here. If the immortal fortress of Babel could not be defended, then what was the point of building a defense line in other places? They could retreat today, but what about after that? Would they have to flee into the wilderness like in the War of the Holy Saints? This time the enemy was not only from the west. Her idea was supported by most of the young officers, but they faced difficulties from reality. The attack of the Twilight Army had broken through the last line of defense, and the scattered citadels and defense facilities outside the Tower of Babel would be completely destroyed in the next few days. Without logistical support, how long could they hold on in this lonely fortress? 1 month, 2 months, half a year, or a year? So on the other hand, to be exact, Duke Ludwig completely disagreed with such a desperate approach. Trapped in the fortress, waiting for the Bugas to solve their internal problems, and then let the Wind Elves change their mind and return to the negotiating table with Madara's undead. How could military operations be so passive and hope for the best possible outcome? But what if it was too late? The world of order could not afford such a loss if the allied forces of the humans and the elves were buried here. His statement was also supported by some people, or even most people. After all, most people still understood the principle of, if you lose the land you can save the people and the land, if you lose the people you can save the land, you can lose the people and the land. And it sounded more logical. Logically speaking, Veronica's heart actually did not disagree with this logic. But the female Legion commander had a deeper hidden concern in her heart. If the Allied forces retreated to the White Mountain and the Autumn Twilight Mountains, then the Empire's passage to Erewhon would be completely exposed. At the mention of the border country in the southeast of the Empire, Veronica felt a little strange in her heart. This was not because she was emotional, but because she had a faint feeling that this matter was not so simple. Although Erewhon was just an inconspicuous existence to most of the Empire's people, it was precisely this small kingdom that had shown amazing strength in the recent civil strife of the Empire. Veronica felt that the young man could not see through him. She always felt that he might have some secrets, otherwise it would be difficult to explain the rapid rise of this small kingdom. What was even more difficult to explain was that if the disaster of the White Mountain could be understood, then why did the Bugas rebel run to Erewhon to stir up trouble? That place had nothing to do with this war at all. What if the purpose of the Twilight Dragon was to destroy this small kingdom from the beginning? The more Veronica thought about it, the more she felt that she might have seen through the Twilight Dragon's movements, but this judgment was completely contrary to her common sense and logic. It did not make sense that the Twilight Dragon's army would not deal with the 2 powerful civilizations of Cruz and Saint Tassol, but first destroy a small border country. She could only speculate that the Twilight Dragon had other intentions. But this was what she found hard to say. A military operation of such a large scale, the meaning behind it could affect the future of the entire continent. No one would judge based on their own conjecture, no matter how confident they were in that conjecture. And she could not prove her conjecture. Because of the disaster of Anzaruta, the land contact between Cruz and Erewhon had long been cut off. Now almost all the news about the kingdom came from the Silver Bay area, but the Silver Bay area actually only received the magic transmission from the south. Now no one could go to Erewhon to confirm the accuracy of the news. After the outbreak of the war, the commercial exchanges in various areas had long been stagnant. Veronica could only choose to stick to her own opinion. But her attitude had tended to be stubborn in the eyes of outsiders, and even those who supported her at the beginning could not help but waver after a period of time. There were also some pro-war parties, most of which were the young people of various noble families. They seemed to have been organized by someone to persuade the hesitant two-faced parties. At first, Duke Ludwig thought that these people were recruited by Veronica, but later he found that the female army commander seemed to be disdainful of such a thing. However, the political influence of these young people was weak, and neither side took them seriously. Duke Ludwig could only shake his head in response to Veronica's stubbornness. No. He kept objecting. The argument between the two became louder and louder, and it even covered the discussion in the hall. People turned their heads to look in this direction. Mangrove's expression was a little awkward, but at this time, a servant hurried in from outside the hall. Mangrove had a bad feeling from the uneasy look on the servant's face. The servant came to his side and leaned over to whisper a few words in his ear. When Mangrove heard this, he suddenly stood up from his seat. "What did you say?" Chapter 1507. We've just received news that the Silver Bay Coalition army was attacked near Canebell. We've lost contact with them for 2 days. Mangrove stood up and looked at the crowd. His expression gradually calmed down as he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was extremely penetrating. It echoed in the hall for a long time. One person, 2 people, and even more people stopped talking. Some people did not react for a while, and some were still looking for the source of the voice. However, the hall gradually quieted down. This silence seemed to be contagious. In the end, even Veronica and Duke Ludwig stopped arguing and looked over. The hall was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. After a while, someone stood up. It was a representative from Silver Bay, probably from Desandro or the Duchy of Sword Poplar. He looked very anxious. "Is the news accurate, my lord?" Mangrove could understand the man's anxiety, but he only nodded slightly in greeting. "It's news from Silver Bay." As soon as this was said, the crowd was in an uproar. "Martha above, how did the coalition army get attacked? Who attacked them? If these monsters appear near Canebell, our escape route is in danger." "Are you kidding me? They're right here, right in front of us." Veronica's beautiful eyebrows were already furrowed. She was very dissatisfied with these incompetent people. She pressed on the table and stood up. Her emerald green eyes were solemn. As soon as she spoke, her majestic voice was like a sharp sword, splitting the noise in the hall into 2. "Enough, stop quarreling." The hall quieted down again. The female army looked straight into everyone's eyes and confirmed, "This is another Dusk army. It seems that they attacked Anzaruta from the south along the Evergreen Corridor. After the invasion of the Georgindy Ridge, we lost control of this area. They entered the wilderness of the 4 realms from here, and from here to here they attacked Canebell." She pressed on the projection crystal in front of her, and a map of the wilderness of the 4 realms appeared in the center of the hall. A bright line appeared in the middle of the map under her guidance. In the eyes of the crowd, that line could be described as a cold dagger piercing into the back of Babel Fortress. It turned out that they were not facing 1 legion but 2. This news was like a blow to the head, hitting many people until they couldn't regain their senses for a long time. Some people's faces began to turn pale, and they slumped back to their seats. Those were the envoys of the small countries. However, there were also some people who still harbored some wishful thinking. They stood up and looked at the map and retorted, "Madame Veronica, where are the Highlanders of Anzaruta? There's no way we didn't receive any news beforehand. We got wind of it, but we didn't pay much attention to it." Veronica drew a circle around Anzaruta and pointed at the place. "We've all seen what the Twilight Legion is like. It's unlikely that the Highlanders who encounter the Crystal Sea will be able to escape, but not all the clans live in this area. The clans living in the peripheral areas may have heard the news, or noticed that some of the clans with whom they have trade relations are silently disappearing, so they began to flee. In fact, they don't need to know what's threatening Anzaruta, but these traditional tribesmen are generally very sensitive. Otherwise they wouldn't have survived so many demonic waves. The migration of the clans in the inner circle squeezed the living space of the weaker clans living in the periphery of Anzaruta, causing a chain reaction that evolved into a great migration that swept across the entire Anzaruta." "Sir, do you mean that the great migration of the Highlanders of Anzaruta may be caused by the Twilight Legion?" "In fact, what the scouts we sent saw was just the surface of this great migration. They couldn't have gone deep into Anzaruta, and those clans in the periphery couldn't have told them what happened in Anzaruta." Veronica looked around at the crowd, her body as straight as a sword, and her voice was rhythmic. She advocated to hold on to Babel Fortress, and this sudden news was extremely unfavorable to her, but the female Legion commander did not have the slightest personal factor in her analysis. We may have made a misjudgment and attributed the reason for this great migration to the disaster caused by the fall of the Black Moon. I think another reason is that the Crystal Cluster deliberately let some of the Highland clans go because they besieged a Cruz Legion there and did not have the ability to destroy all the Highlanders. You mean the Red Legion may be in Anzaruta? Mangrove suddenly raised his head. I can't guarantee it, old vulture, but it's not normal that they have lost contact with us for so long. But if we link the two together, the possibility is the greatest. Veronica looked at her old partner and explained her thoughts. The resonance tower of the Crystal Cluster has the effect of blocking magic communication. It's not difficult to explain why there is no news of the Red Legion. In other words, this is a speculation? Mangrove raised his thick eyebrows. The situation could be said to be bad, but as a general who had experienced hundreds of battles, his face was very calm. The general fumbled for a while and took out a pipe from his pocket, then realized that there was no fire. He shook his head and helplessly put it on the table. But it's also the most likely speculation. As a soldier we can't guarantee anything, but at least we have to have the ability to make decisions, right? Veronica looked at the hesitant envoys and shook her head disdainfully. Their appearance in Canebell has sent another signal, and that is, we may not be able to count on the Red Legion. They may have already freed up their hands. The Silver Bay Coalition army was a surprise to them, but soon it will be our turn. Everyone looked at her slender fingers and saw another line drawn in the wilderness of 4 territories, straight to the back of the Alcash area. Even the sound of breathing had quieted down. There was a deathly silence in the dark environment. No one would ask if the crystal clusters would have such a strategic vision, because they had clearly revealed their fangs. Even if they were just a bunch of purple beasts without any thoughts, their master had already proven the brilliance of their tactics. A cold and cunning commander, a tireless and fearless army. For some reason at this moment the first thing that came to everyone's mind was the undead of Madara. Perhaps they were the only ones who could fight against these monsters? Everyone could not help but have this thought in their minds. Let's vote. Mangrove straightened his coat and stood up from his seat. He raised his thick eyebrows and looked at everyone present. Time is even more pressing. Instead of arguing endlessly, why don't we vote directly? Whether we stay or leave, there is no need to waste any more time. This voice, which was not loud, reverberated above the empty vault. Everyone could not help but hold their breath. Stay or leave. It seemed that there was only one choice. But at this moment, the hall fell into a strange silence. Even the most radical person from before did not take the initiative to speak. Duke Ludwig stood silently in the same place, frowning as he pondered his decision. The situation that everyone was facing was so hopeless. The power that wanted to destroy the world was strong enough to make everyone's hearts waver, and they began to doubt the decision that they originally thought was right. Veronica looked at these people and sighed. These people were already beginning to feel afraid. How could they stay? She could not help but look at Tumen, who was sitting opposite her. This legendary figure rarely expressed his opinion during the entire process of the meeting. This old man was like a silent observer, and he did not say a word about whether people were right or wrong. She saw the old man raise his head and nod at her with a slight smile. When people began to raise their hands to vote, Duke Mihodafen took a last glance at the hall below, then walked back from the balcony and returned to the room. There were only a few people in the room. His daughter was among them, and beside her was his eldest son and the Prime Minister, Nydevan. Then there was the head of the Corny family who was related to the royal family. The vice-captain of the Knight Regiment stood at the side with a sour expression. On the other side, the old Prime Minister, Nydevan, was sitting on a chair, his eyelids drooping as if he had fallen asleep. Charcoal was burning in the hearth of the fireplace, and the bright flames dyed the narrow room dark red. Everyone's shadows were elongated, making threatening gestures on the mottled walls, like demons and ghosts. The Duke looked at his daughter and ordered, "Vahina, hand over the ring. Do you know what you are doing?" Everyone looked at her. The oppressive atmosphere in the room seemed to be on her alone. Vahina bit her lips, and her heart was filled with fear, but she still shook her head. "Are you crazy?" Count Mihodafen glared at his sister. "I don't know what's wrong with you, but that's a token of the royal family. You should return it to the Prime Minister before the great cathedral and His Highness the Crown Prince arrive." But when he remembered that she was his sister, his heart softened. "For the sake of my father and me, Lord Nydevan will not hold it against you." "Brother," Vahina replied firmly, "if it's the Prime Minister, he will definitely understand why I'm doing this." Is it really my fault? The ring is not missing, but why hasn't His Highness the Crown Prince ascended the throne? Umph. Duke Mehodafen snorted heavily. He looked at his son with disappointment. Compared to him, this brat did not have the decisiveness of a noble. But when he looked at Vahina, his head hurt even more. This daughter of his had some of the courage he had when he was young, but she was much more daring than him. More importantly, she was brainless. He knew who was adding fuel to the fire behind the scenes. That woman was simply a disaster. Thinking of this, he could not help but look at the old prime minister who had been silent all this time. Not a single person in this family was easy to deal with. He had experienced the iron rule of the Silver Queen's father, the previous Kurlutz the Great, and his granddaughter's methods were exactly the same as his at that time. Duke Mehodafen complained that his daughter was not as smart, but when he thought of the fact that the prime minister was facing the same predicament as him and had a son who was not so outstanding, his heart calmed down a lot. At this time, the head of the Corny family could not help but speak up. Miss Vahina, no matter what you think, you should at least hand over the ring. You should at least admit that it doesn't belong to you, right? That's not a guess. Vahina wasn't that polite to outsiders and snorted coldly. That ring doesn't belong to me, but it's hard to say if it belongs to the Kurlutz royal family now. Shut up. Vahina, are you crazy? The Duke of Mehodafen and the young Count of Mehodafen shouted at the same time. Especially the latter, who was sweating profusely as he looked at the old Prime Minister, Nidevan. But what made him feel strange was that the head of the Corny family did not refute him immediately, and the old Prime Minister only frowned slightly. Then the old man finally opened his eyes. His turbid eyes seemed to contain two sharp swords, so sharp that no one dared to look directly at them. All right, there's no need to say anything more, he spoke slowly, his voice old but powerful as if it was filled with magic, causing the room to quiet down. Vahina is not wrong, this mistake is not her fault. The great saint and I only had our own considerations, but we did not expect things to turn out this way. The old man looked at Vahina, as if he was sizing her up. In front of him, the daughter of the Lord of Flowers and Leaves was only a child. In his era, even her father was only a junior, and even the old duke had to be respectful in front of him. But he was the eagle of the empire. Tens of millions of Kroo citizens had received protection under his wings, and he did not need to threaten a little girl to maintain his prestige. Moreover, to him, power and status were only decorations. His wisdom was passed down by word of mouth, and his power and authority were deeply ingrained in the hearts of every citizen of the empire. Rather than saying that he was the prime minister of the empire, it was more accurate to say that he established the prestige of the prime minister of the empire. Vahina, old Nidevan asked, do you want to use this ring to change the noble's decision? Vahina did not expect the old man to ask her personally. She opened her mouth, but her heart was still a little uneasy. The old man was Delphian's grandfather. She and Delphian were best friends, but she had only seen this legendary figure a few times in the banquets of the White Rose Garden. Every time she saw the arrogant and domineering nobles behave like obedient students in front of the former prime minister of the empire, she was secretly shocked. Sometimes, people's understanding of authority was imperceptibly ingrained in their hearts. Even Vahina was not an exception. She suddenly thought that perhaps Delphian's ambition for power came from her worship of this old man. Vahina nodded hesitantly in response to the old man's question. When faced with the unknown, people would always feel uneasy, especially when they knew that the unknown had destructive power. The old man nodded and continued to ask, can you tell me why you want them to stay here? This is not my decision but Mr. Brando's. Count Tonagel? Count Mehodafen and the patriarch of the Corny family were stunned. Vahina was ready to throw caution to the wind. She knew that stealing the holy ring of fire was a disgraceful act, so she had to stand her ground. If she could not convince the others, not only her but her entire family would be implicated. But for some reason Vahina did not feel too much regret. After everything was said, she only felt a sense of relief. There were some things that had to be done. Because if she did not do it, she would miss the chance to change everything. Vahina gathered her courage and raised her voice. I think we all know this. When we faced the Silver Queen, it was not us, but Mr. Brando who defeated her and saved the empire. Wait, Miss Vahina, the patriarch of the Corny family said, the people of Kroo are not ungrateful people, but this does not mean that we have to listen to an outsider. This is not our personal matter, it is related to the future of the empire and even the world. Vahina glanced at him. There was a hint of disdain in her blue eyes. We know what is right. The Babel Tower is just a symbol, it is not powerful enough to turn the tide of the war. But in fact, Everyone in Cruz knows why it is here and what it symbolizes. The vice-captain of the Flame Knight Regiment heard this and opened his mouth to say something, but in the end he did not say anything and only let out a long sigh. Vahaina continued, "The Babel Tower is really protecting the Saint Tassol behind it, the land of the elves. But its meaning is not only that, because the land behind us is the last line of the wound world of order, our last hope. But in front of this hope, the people of Cruz hesitated. We only remember the enmity and hatred of each other for 1,000 years, but we have forgotten that humans and elves were originally close comrades. If we choose to retreat today, perhaps the people of Cruz will survive, but at the same time, we have given up our last hope. One day we will regret this. We can retreat today, but what about tomorrow? Our future, where is it, living in fear all day long? But even if we stay, what can we get?" Count Mihotefen could not help but ask his sister, "Besides sacrificing in vain, what else can we get?" "Perhaps it is an opportunity." Opportunity? Count Mihotefen was shocked, only to find that the one who answered his question was the old man who represented the supreme power of the empire. A promise from 1,000 years ago in exchange for an opportunity to put aside the enmity between the two ancient kingdoms. Do we believe in the Wind Elves? Do we believe that even if the people of Cruz die, the elves will pick up our legacy and continue to move forward? The old prime minister shook his head. "We do not believe, so the people of Cruz cannot shed blood and sacrifice everything for this land called Saint Tassol. But 1,000 years ago we both believed in this. If that oath was still there, the kings who signed that oath left this world one by one. But today their descendants were faced with the same choice." "Child," the old prime minister suddenly spoke to Faina, "do you understand the meaning of your decision?" Faina nodded. Of course she understood, but this was also a heavy task. The weight of the ring was not only the weight of the empire. It was also a trust. Delphian's trust in her, Brando's trust in the elves and humans, the people's trust in the ancient oath, and Her Highness Constance's trust in the person she chose. She believed that the last task she gave before her death would change the fate of this world forever. At that moment, the meaning of royalty and country had already succumbed to the survival of civilization. And this was the power of order. She stretched out her hand, opening her palm to reveal the beautiful ring. It looked very ordinary, made of pure gold without any decorations, only the emblem of a flame shining brightly under the light of the furnace. It was as if a flame was burning in the eyes of everyone present. The old prime minister looked at the ring and nodded. But then he smiled bitterly. The old man knew in his heart who was the one standing in front of him in this game of chess. He had never failed in his life, but in the end he was stabbed in the back by his own granddaughter. He really raised a good granddaughter. He turned his head and said, "Your Excellency the Great Saint, Your Highness the Prince, you heard it. Now come in." Faina was shocked when she heard this, and when she saw the two people who came in, her beautiful eyes widened. Chapter 1508. Before Yeruta left, he felt the uneasiness in his heart again. He looked back at his sister, Peya, and the King of Lorendale. In the corridor ahead, the tall French arched windows were lined with each other, and the soft sunlight shone through the glass on the ground, leaving a bright mark every few meters. Through the light, dust fluttered and light and shadow intertwined to form a deep space. At the end of the corridor, it seemed to lead to an unknown world. And Istavil looked at him calmly, and his thin face was more serious than ever. "Go, Your Highness," he said. "But I don't know if I can do it." Yeruta was a little afraid, and because of this he shrank back. Istavil said to him, "The king of Saint Tassol must make his own decisions." "But what if it's wrong?" Yeruta asked. "Here's how we go about doing something. We think it over and over again in advance, and then we make up our minds. Once we've made up our minds, we have to show the courage to take responsibility for it," said Isdowel. "No one can avoid making mistakes, but they can't be muddle-headed. Have you thought it over, Your Highness?" "I have, Mr. Istavil. I think Brother Brando's decision is right. In this common war we should be more united, shouldn't we? So you've made up your mind?" Yeruta nodded thoughtfully. "Then if you're wrong you'll be criticized for it. Are you afraid of criticism?" Istavil asked. "No, I'm not afraid, Mr. Istavil," Yeruta said, "because I believe our starting point is right. Even if there is a setback for a while, it won't be because of the resolution itself. I'll find the root of the problem and correct it. I'm not afraid of difficulties because difficulties can always be overcome." The King of Lorendale couldn't help but be infected by the boy's spirit. It's always good to be simple. Perhaps he will encounter many things in the future and find that the world is not as simple as he thought. But as long as there is this heart, then all difficulties can always be overcome. In that case, what else do you have to worry about, Your Highness? He asked again. Yoruta's eyes dimmed. But I am your crown prince, am I not? Aren't you worried that I am close to Mr. Brando? Do you think that your future king will listen to an outsider and put the interests of Saint Tassol before the interests of other countries? Is that why he made such a decision? After hearing this question, Istiville laughed and said, Your Highness, the elves are not ungrateful people. He looked at the human youth with even more admiration in his eyes. The fact that you can say these words today proves that you are the same as us. Wind Empress's insight is indeed extraordinary. But Yoruta still didn't quite understand what the elf lord meant. Istiville continued, Your Highness, do you really think that Count Tonajul made the right choice? To this, Yoruta nodded without hesitation. That's enough, Istiville replied loudly. As long as you think it's really right, you can go ahead and do it. The elves will be behind you as your solid backing. Hearing this answer, Yoruta was stunned. The attitude of the king of Lorendale was completely beyond his expectations. And his sister, the huntress Peya, came up as if no one else was around. As the daughter of the mountain people, she didn't have much to say, and just silently put the sacred ring of the Wind Empress in the palm of her brother's hand. Although silent, her soft eyes had contained all the words she wanted to say to her brother. It was a traditional and tenacious quality that the mountain people had adhered to for generations. It was simple, but it was beautiful. Yoruta held the sacred ring in his hand, and the ring shone brightly in the darkness. The elves looked at this scene, and the long line bent down one by one, like a silver wave, on both sides of the promenade, facing the future king forward. The youth looked at this scene, and suddenly a trickle of warmth flowed through his heart. It was like a whisper whispering in his ear, the glory and faith of this elf kingdom for thousands of years. It was an ancient recognition. The youth felt a little bitter at the corner of his eyes, and he gently raised his hand and wiped it with the back of his hand. He swore that he would not let anyone down. Everything was coming to an end. Veronica looked at the hands that were raised like a mountain forest, and the depression and disappointment in her heart became more and more pervasive. It was true that no one in this world would want to die, and in the face of death, everyone was equally fearful. Especially after the hot blood had dissipated, there was only the instinct to live. This was also the need for the continuation of any race, and perhaps it was not shameful. But compared to death, what was more terrible was the loss of hope. A mortal's life, compared to the long history, was like a moment. Conferring the title of wife and children and achieving success and fame were the needs of life. But when death came, everything returned to nothingness. Then for thousands of years, people seemed to repeat this process repeatedly in their busy lives. What was the point of existence? There were very few people who had doubts about their life. This was because civilizations and races composed of individuals were built on countless gravel. Gravel came and went, empires rose and fell, honor and disgrace and history moved forward, but it eventually left a mark. The people of the mortal world changed the world and the future little by little. Perhaps everyone was repeating the process from life to death, but today and tomorrow were different after all. Perhaps the future and hope were the ultimate answer to this question. However, at this moment, this answer had lost its meaning. In her disappointment, Veronica heard a noble next to her choking, "Thank God, I can finally leave this damned place. I'm scared every day, afraid that one day I'll never see my family again. As long as the elves allow us to enter, I'll immediately take my family and move to Kororis. If the Twilight Dragon attacks that place, I'll find a way to go to the Nine Phoenix." Veronica turned around and saw the tear-stained noble. She did not know what kind of mood made her ask the other party, "After the Nine Phoenix, where will we go?" The noble could not answer and was stunned for a moment. Veronica saw this and shook her head. She suddenly felt a little dispirited. She separated the crowd and walked out, wanting to leave this place. But at a glance, she saw Duke Ludwig still sitting not far away. It was sad to say that the other party was the first to stand firmly against her, but in the vote, he unexpectedly chose to abstain. Duke Ludwig sat in his seat at a loss. He wanted to reach for his pocket watch several times, but his hands were trembling so badly that he could only grab empty air. Veronica looked at this person and understood that perhaps between the two ways of hanging, the latter had chosen the crueler way. He had obliterated her hope. But perhaps the others could leave with more dignity because of this. Even though Veronica wanted to say something in front of Duke Ludwig, who seemed to have aged 10 years in an instant, she found it difficult to speak. She felt a sense of suffocation in her heart. Staying in this fortress might not be the right choice, but where was the right choice? Could it be that she had lost all hope? She could stay here and die generously. But what about the others? At the corner of the round table, Great Druid Grey Fury saw this scene and shook his head. He got up and left his seat. The craftsman wizards of the Silver Alliance were also leaving. Although they did not express any opinions from the beginning, the wizards were only discussing with each other, shaking their heads from time to time. There were few smiles on their faces. Only the representatives of the Highlanders and the Highlanders were still sitting in their seats, looking at the representatives of Silver Bay on the other side as if it had nothing to do with them. These small nobles were discussing whether they should stay or leave. More importantly, how should the allied forces of Silver Bay be saved? The people of Fanzan also got up and tidied up the various parchments on the table. Behind them, the envoys of the various states of White City had left earlier and were walking out in groups. The hall was noisy, and some people even nodded at Great Druid Grey Fury. But then, the wind elves in the hall who had been watching coldly from the sidelines suddenly stood up in unison and looked towards the south door of the hall. Veronica was about to leave when she noticed that not far away, Duke Ludwig, who had been oblivious to the changes in his surroundings, had a look of surprise on his face. He stood up shakily from his seat and looked straight behind her. She subconsciously turned around. Many people were also turning around. The Bugis stopped outside the north door, and the envoys of the various states of White City were blocked behind them. Both sides were turning around and looking in this direction. The people who were still in their seats stopped what they were doing. The people of Fanzan looked at their colleagues, and the representatives of Silver Bay looked at each other. Great Druid Grey Fury slowed down his steps and turned around, looking in their direction with some surprise. Crack! A light sound was heard. The door to the south was pushed open with a creaking sound. The hall fell silent for a moment, because people saw rows of elven guards in silver armor and winged helmets pouring in from outside the door and escorting a human youth into the hall. All the wind elves in the hall bowed subconsciously at this moment. But what they bowed to was not the human youth. It was the thing in the youth's hand. It was a ring. Under everyone's gaze, Yeruda walked down the stairs with the holy ring in his hand and came to the round table where the elven representatives were sitting. He raised his head and looked at all the nobles in the hall, then raised the ring and gently placed it on the table. On the ring, the 9-patterned sacred emblem of Saint Tassol shone in the dim light in the center of the hall. The ring of the Wind Empress. Someone with sharp eyes recognized him and blurted out in surprise. Veronica's gaze froze and she felt her heart beat faster. Not far away, the great druid's face also showed surprise. Yeruda looked at everyone present. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were also focused on the son of the former hunter. But there was no sign of retreat in the youth's heart. On the contrary, there was only infinite courage surging in his chest. Because today he understood what he was going to do. It represented a promise that had not been realized for 1,000 years. 1,000 years later, it would be realized again in the hands of the descendants of the Mist Elves, in the hands of today's Wind Elves. A long overdue promise. Yeruda said quietly, "The Wind Elves of Saint Tassol are willing to stay and guard this fortress." The voice that echoed over the hall was not loud, and it even sounded a little childish. But every word weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked at the seats of the crew's people, and the hall was so quiet that a pin drop could be heard. The crew's nobles were stunned. Are these elves crazy? The Bugis stopped whispering to each other, and beside them, the great druid sat back in his seat thoughtfully as if waiting for something. Only the Wind Elves stared at the ring, and then looked at their future king with a serious expression. Yeruda spoke again, "Then former allies, the descendants of the Flame King, where are they today? Do you still remember your oath?" Veronica subconsciously wanted to separate the crowd and return to her seat. How could the crew's people break their promise? Even if it was in her own name, she must stay and fight side by side with the elves. But before she could open her mouth, a clear and powerful voice had already answered for her. "The crew's people are here. Who's talking? Who dares to represent the crew's people without authorization?" A noble counselor stood up, shaking his fat head and looking around, trying to find the person who spoke. But his words were immediately stuck in his throat. The crowd was parting left and right, automatically making a path. In the middle of that path, the heavily armored Flame family knights stood opposite each other, and 16 knights escorted a girl into the hall. The blonde girl also held up a ring in her hand. But it was more like a flame. The golden flame ring was burning on her hand. Someone in the crowd swallowed. "The holy ring of fire." Vahina walked down the stairs step by step and came to the round table. She looked at the young hunter in front of her. Then she solemnly put the ring in her hand on the table, raised her head and replied to the Wind Elves, "The 2 rings bear witness to this oath, The crew's people are willing to fight side by side with former allies. The elves nodded. We may have had a grudge, behind Yeruda, Istiville, the king of Lorendale replied, but today it's all written off. We were comrades 1,000 years ago and it's the same today. By the holy ring, the elves replied in unison. Yeruda looked at the noble daughter with some admiration. He also raised the holy ring of the Wind Empress, and replied with the same solemnity, by the holy ring, in mid-air. Two holy rings that were shining brightly, facing each other. Everything was like the scene 1,000 years ago. It's a pity that there are only two. The great druid looked at this scene and could not help but sigh. Perhaps the era of the 7 precepts had long been a thing of the past. At the top of the city of Candlebell, the defense line of the Silver Bay Coalition army was falling apart. But the real despair in the hearts of the people did not come from the overwhelming Dusk army. Blank stood behind the battlements with a solemn face. Beside him, Nun Princess Magadal was covering her mouth, looking at the scene in horror. It was a gigantic black sphere that was revealing itself outside Canderbell City. Martha above, what the hell is that? White Mountain. The Wind Elves and the vampires stood facing each other. The 26 representatives looked at each other, pulled out chairs and sat on both sides of a long table. After looking at both sides for a moment, the clerk quietly picked up a quill and wrote the first sentence on the parchment. An era has passed. The huge silver dragon flapped its wings and landed on the ruins of a city. Delphian was the first to jump down from the silver dragon's back. She landed on the ground. Other than the Buga envoy who came to greet her, she also saw two unexpected people. Huang Hua and Fang Qi stood facing each other. The former looked at her and smiled. You're here, Miss Delphian, Fanzin's eastern border, Great Glacier. The Elven Queen looked at the ice mountain shining with purple light in the distance. Her people, the Wild Elf army, were falling in waves on the way to attack. Fanzin's night had gathered into a torrent, but they were still unable to tear a hole in the No Race's defense line. Suddenly, a purple light flashed in the sky. She looked up in the cold wind as if she suddenly realized something. It has finally begun, the final battle that has been going on for 1,000 years. Erwin Lighthouse Citadel. In the underground black prison, the girl looked up at the only ray of light that shone down from the ceiling. Her hands and feet were shackled with heavy iron shackles, and with the slightest movement the iron chains locked on the wall rattled. After a moment she closed her eyes silently. She was no stranger to darkness. Rosy blood dripped along the cold metal. Brando. Chapter 1509. With a creak, Amandina raised her head in the darkness and turned her stiff neck. Out of the corner of her eye she saw someone open the iron door, and the jailer led the others in from outside. Then came the sound of flint striking, and soon the light of a fire lit up. The bright torch was held in the hands of the clumsy woman, and the light shone into Amandina's eyes, causing her to squint uncomfortably. Outside the iron door stood two knights in addition to the woman. They wore armor that was very different from the style of Erwin, and the metal armor reflected a bright luster in the light of the fire. The two knights, one older and the other younger. Let her out. The older knight ordered the woman who was in charge of Amandina's custody. Wait, my lord, she's shackled. The woman took out a bunch of keys and quickly replied, let me unlock it for her first. Then hurry up. The knight said impatiently. The woman came to Amandina's side and grabbed the shackles on her hands. Amandina struggled symbolically but to no avail. The former deftly inserted the key into the hole and twisted it, and the shackles on her hands fell off with a clatter. The shackles were connected to the wall of the dungeon with an iron chain. It was only a few meters long, and within the range of the chain she could not leave her bed. The dungeon was dark and damp, full of a moldy smell, and there was a messy pile of straw in the corner. Occasionally, a few rats could be seen scurrying over it. The young knight frowned as he looked at the environment. He looked at the heavy metal shackles on the ground, and then looked at the scars on the female prisoner's snow-white wrists, and could not help but feel sympathy. Who is this woman? Is she an extremely powerful witch? Oh, the older knight chuckled. Don't underestimate her, this woman is not simple. I heard that she is the princess of this small country. But be careful, Wizard Sodder wants to see her, don't cause any problems for me. The young knight let out a hollow laugh and quickly nodded in agreement. Amandina felt the shackles on her feet lighten, and the clumsy woman unlocked the shackles on her feet. But the woman obviously did not know what it meant to have tender feelings for a woman, or perhaps it was jealousy. She purposely used force when she lifted Amandina's ankle, causing Amandina to frown in pain. But of course Amandina would not bow to a mere maid. She gritted her teeth and stood up. Although the conditions here were not as good as her home in Bragg's, it was not too far off. She did not say a word, but in her heart, she was secretly paying attention to the situation at the moment. She had been locked up here for more than half a month. It was as if the other party had forgotten about her existence and only allowed this careless woman to guard her. What was going on today? In this half a month, Amandina had basically confirmed her location. This should be the lighthouse near Kirkle. She could see a large number of black pine trees outside the castle when she was outside. These trees that she was familiar with were widely distributed in the Grimoires province. There was a river near the castle that flowed into a bright body of water in the distance, but she did not know whether it was a lake or the sea. But it should be a lake. Grimoires was not close to the sea, but it was close to the largest lake in Erewhon, Lake Valendon. Amandina had been to another famous castle in the Grimoires province during the Second War of the Black Rose, Fort Vermeer near Bragg's. But the layout there was very different from here, and it was unlikely that these people would send her to Madara's undead territory. After confirming her location, the thing she wanted to do the most was to send this information out, but the woman guarding her was stubborn. Even though she would occasionally tell her about the situation outside, Amandina always felt that it was because there was someone behind her who ordered her to do so. What are these people planning to do with me? She felt that these people were not from Erewhon. Amandina did not forget that she was brought to this place as Princess Griffin. Even if the people of Erewhon did not know the princess, they should at least know that the current heir of the royal family of Corvado had mixed elven blood. However, the knights and wizards who escorted her ignored her identity. Knights and wizards were close to nobles in Erewhon, especially the head of a knight. Once a person was conferred the title of a baron, it was unlikely that these people did not know about the members of the royal family of their own country. It was impossible that they did not know about Princess Griffin's hair color and basic appearance. This princess was not one of the dozens of daughters of the kings of other countries. King Oberg VII only had one daughter, and the princess was not unknown in Erewhon. However, the indifference shown by the people who captured her towards the princess's identity was very strange. More importantly, the words of the elder knight made her heart skip a beat. Don't underestimate her. This woman is not simple. I heard that she is the princess of this small country. But be careful, Wizard Sodder wants to see her. Don't cause any trouble. The princess of this small country. They were not from Erewhon. But where were they from? Why were they in Erewhon? If they said that Erewhon was a small country, then their country must be very big. Even if it was not as big as the four great empires, it should not be comparable to a small kingdom or dukedom. She first confirmed that these people were not from Cruz. The Cruz people's golden hair color and blue eyes were their most obvious characteristics. Even the mixed blood people more or less retained this characteristic. What's more, Cruz was close to Erewhon, and the relationship between the two countries was still messy. Even if the Cruz people did not take Erewhon seriously, they should have at least heard of the princess's reputation. After all, the princess was known throughout the Silver Bay coastal states for her appearance. Amandina suddenly thought of another title that the other party mentioned. Wizard Sodder. She was slightly startled, but then her heart skipped a beat. Wasn't that the leader of the Bugas? Amandina had a good memory, and her knowledge was something that few people in Trentheim could match. Although she did not know the Bugas as well as Brendel did, she at least knew the names of the 12 leaders of the Bugas wizards. Could it be that the Bugas were behind this? Amandina suddenly felt a chill in her heart. If the mastermind behind this conspiracy was really the Bugas, then how could she resist? How could Erewhon resist these high and mighty silver people? The more she thought about it, the more flustered she became. She was suddenly afraid that Brando would come to her rescue. That was the leader of the Bugas. No matter how powerful he was, how could he be a match for the best of the silver people? Every leader of the Bugas had existed for a long time. Even the youngest of them, Silverfire Tulaman, had existed for 100 or 200 years. And Wizard Sodder was one of the most powerful of them. In fact, it was said that the power of this wizard was only second to a few super first-rate existences in the Silver Alliance. Those few people were Solomon, William, and Harionov. But maybe not? Amandina bit her lower lip. These people might be intimidating her just to break her psychological defenses. It was not that she did not have such doubts in her heart. After all, the Bugas had not interfered in the affairs of the surface for hundreds of years. Why would they suddenly break their own tradition? Help her up. At this time the older knight spoke to the jailer. The clumsy woman came over and was about to lift her arm, but Amandina frowned and swept her hand away, standing up on her own. The knight looked at her in surprise but did not say anything. Amandina looked at the two knights and suddenly remembered another legend. Could these people be the legendary Banksians? Legend had it that the Banksians were slaves of magic. The Banksians were obsessed with magic and worshipped the Bugas in the sky. In the year of the dragon's fall, this people voluntarily became the followers of the Sassalts. Among the Banksians there were generally only two professions, wizard or knight. The arcane knight was a specialty of the Banksians. Knights were often the guards and followers of wizards, and it was said that for any Banksians becoming a knight of the Silver Folk was their highest honor. Just like the Bugas, every Banksian was a potential wizard. Those who could not become wizards would be eliminated to participate in knight training, and those who could not become wizards or knights would be demoted to lowly jobs like craftsmen and merchants. Because every Banksian knight was an eliminated wizard, they often spent a lot of time learning magic knowledge. This caused them to be much weaker in terms of combat skills and physique compared to the real knights who were trained as knights from a young age. However, there were gains and losses. After the baptism of the mana pool, the Banksian arcane knight could cast magic while wearing heavy armor. This gave them a great advantage in battles with other human and elven knights. As a result, the reputation of the arcane knight spread like wildfire. When Amandina saw the senior knight use an invisible force to open the door to the dungeon, the last shred of hope in her heart was extinguished. They really were the Banksian knight. Could the Sassard Alliance be far away? When she read about this from the books, she never thought that she would one day meet the Banksians like this. She had once longed for the vastness and wonders of the world, the beauty of the 9 phoenixes, the vastness of the Rubik Desert, the desolation and barrenness of the Sea of the Dying Moon, and the different ecology of the mortal kingdoms under the Sassard Alliance and the 4 great empires. She also had a dream to see the places described in the books with her own eyes. But today, when one of her long-cherished wishes came true, Amandina felt a chill in her heart. She silently followed behind the two, her hands clenched into fists. Her fingertips were white and her nails were almost digging into her flesh, but she did not feel any pain. It was as if all the blood in her body was flowing back. She did not even know how she managed to walk this distance. This really was the lighthouse. When she saw the main structure of the castle, she had already confirmed this. The lighthouse was built in the year 447 under the supervision of a wind elf, so the main structure of the castle was left with the aesthetic style of the elves. The bard Cody once said that this castle was one of the most beautiful castles in the Erewhon Kingdom, and it lived up to its reputation. But Amandina was not in the mood to admire it. Why would the Sassard Alliance suddenly be interested in a small country like the Erewhon Kingdom? Why would they want to capture the princess? No, Amandina shook her head in her heart. These people's real goal was to find someone with the pure bloodline of the Erewhon Kingdom, but this bloodline was not limited to the Corvado royal family, otherwise she would not be able to pass the test. Could it be that the royal bloodline of the Erewhon Kingdom was hiding some kind of secret? But if that was the case, shouldn't the purest royal bloodline be the descendants of House Cypher? Why would they look for the siblings of the Corvado royal family? Her heart was filled with doubts. 2 knights guarded Amandina as she entered through the main door, passed through the hall and went up the stairs. Amandina looked on coldly as she continued to fill in her guesses. After being imprisoned for half a month, the other party suddenly asked to see her. Why was that? Perhaps the other party had completely controlled the situation in the Erewhon Kingdom and was ready to lay all their cards on the table. Or perhaps there was another reason. They needed an insider familiar with Princess Griffin to confirm her identity. And this person had already arrived. She quickly ruled out the first possibility. According to what the maid told her about the situation outside, although the rebels had the upper hand, they had yet to turn it into a victory. They had not even captured the real princess, and the situation was still very worrying. It seemed that the Sassard Alliance was not completely without scruples and had not completely made their move. Of course, Amandina did not know that because of the White Mountain disaster, the Sassard Alliance's grey mages were divided into 2, and the main force was not in the Erewhon Kingdom. Of course, for these high and mighty silver folk, this small number of people was far enough to overturn this small kingdom. Since that was the case, there was only the second possibility left. Who would be the one who would come? Knight Amandina had long suspected that there was a traitor in the royal faction. Otherwise, these Banksians would not have been able to find her and her highness so accurately and attack Prince Haruz, who was on a diplomatic mission in Lantan Island. This traitor must not be a member of the local nobles because they did not have the ability to access core secrets, and it could not be an old noble because the old nobles could not gain the trust of her highness. So this person could only be a member of the royal faction and must be a core member. Although Amandina was very reluctant to believe that there would be such a crazy person in the royal faction, which once represented Erwin's beliefs, the facts could not be ignored. A few names instantly appeared in her mind. These names even included the person she was closest to and most trusted. After all, everyone knew about his relationship with the Bugis. Amandina almost bit her lip until it bled. Although she would never believe that the Lord would betray Erwin, her natural calmness and rationality made her have to consider this possibility. But whether it was the Lord or not, as long as it was anyone on this list, it was enough to have a devastating blow to the kingdom. Amandina couldn't help but feel gloomy. Everyone often hated traitors more than enemies, and she was no exception. The pain of being betrayed was difficult for outsiders to understand. Amandina clenched her teeth so hard that they almost broke. If hatred could kill, then the real traitor would have died a long time ago. After walking through a long passage in silence, the knight stopped. The young knight took 2 steps forward and knocked on the wooden door in front of them. With a creak, the wooden door opened, and a small head popped out from behind, staring at the 3 of them warily. It was the first time Amandina had seen such a strange magical creature. The other party had a wide nose and big ears, full of distrust towards humans, and asked in a shrill voice, "What are you doing? The master is receiving a guest." The 2 knights did not dare to be negligent. They knew that this demon was one of Wizard Soder's attendants and quickly replied, "My lord wants to see her." The demon glanced at Amandina, and that gloomy gaze made Amandina feel as if she had been stabbed by a sword, and her face turned pale. But fortunately the demon quickly withdrew his gaze and nodded, "I'll go and report, you stay here." With that he closed the door. But it was at this moment that a reprimand came from inside the door. It was a woman's angry scream. "Those trash that you promised me are all done for. Soder, you'd better take care of your own troubles. Don't let them affect your other plans. That hateful woman really didn't put the throne of destiny in the stagnation realm, and now I can confirm that it is here, but it's not that simple, you'd better be careful." Another voice hurriedly explained, "No, my lord, listen to me, it's just a little trouble. I didn't expect Erwin's people to have the strength to resist. It must be those damn fellows from the Silver Society. But it doesn't matter, I'm mobilizing my men stationed near White Mountain, my lord. You have to believe that mere mortals can't stop the Silver Folk. As for Tonagil's trouble..." This voice obviously belonged to Wizard Soder, but Amandina was slightly puzzled. Who could make this wizard leader tremble in fear? Could that woman be the mastermind behind all of this? The woman's voice coldly interrupted Baron Soder. "Don't worry about Tonagil anymore, the beacon is already in that person's hands, what you have to do is to find the key first. I hope you can do this well this time, don't let me down again, Soder, you know what will happen to you. Besides," she paused, "don't blame me for not reminding you. If you don't really take your opponents seriously, I think you may not be able to leave this place. But in that case you don't have to worry about what your opponents will do to you anyway, you don't need to know this." Amandina wanted to continue listening, but she suddenly heard a scream. The wooden door in front of her suddenly shattered into pieces, and a black shadow flew out. It was the spirit from before, but it had already crashed into the wall not far away. Blood flowed out from its head as it breathed its last. Then a young girl stepped on the debris on the ground and walked out. In the smoke, the young girl saw Amandina and softly made a sound of surprise. Amandina froze at the same time because she actually saw the merchant girl. No, that wasn't completely the Roman girl. Because although her size and appearance were exactly the same as the merchant girl, her temperament and demeanor were completely different, and her black hair was completely different from the somewhat curly brown hair of the merchant girl, and her eyes were actually a bright gold. Those eyes made her somewhat flirtatious appearance full of majesty, like 2 blazing golden flames. She looked up at Amandina, who was not taller than her, and her eyes were filled with surprise. You. Amandina's heart was filled with fear. "You're Dusk?" The merchant girl smiled slightly. She stretched out her snow-white and slender fingers, and lifted Amandina's chin, even though the latter was already much taller than her. "Look at who this is, my dear Amandina." She smiled, turned her head, and said to Sorcerer Soder, who had chased after her, "This is the key you found, Princess Erwin?" "My lady, Sorcerer Soder was shocked, and just as he was about to say something, Amandina coldly looked at him, and a cloud of black fog had already surged out of her petite body, turning into a black cloud and disappearing from the corridor. "Just you wait, Soder, you better not ruin my plans." Amandina's shrill voice echoed in the corridor. "And my dear friend, I will cherish the memories between us, but farewell forever." Amandina's face was white as a sheet. Chapter 15:10. The merchant girl's shrill laughter lingered in the corridor as she slowly disappeared into the distance. The two Bansha knights stared at the scene with their mouths agape as the black smoke dissipated into the corridor. Sorcerer Sadar's dark gaze swept over them. "What are you waiting for?" he said coldly. "Clean this place up." The two knights, one old and one young, hurriedly lowered their heads and acknowledged. Sadar turned around and looked at Amandina from head to toe. The woman's words before she left made him feel that something was wrong. "Are you the princess of this kingdom?" Amandina looked into his eyes without fear, her gaze clear and firm, but she did not say a word. Sadar snorted coldly in his heart when he saw this. He knew that his hypnosis did not work. Even though a wizard's mind control spell was powerful, it had to be built on the premise that the target was not on guard. If the target was familiar with your methods, then the chances were even slimmer. He was afraid that he would damage the little girl's brain, so he did not continue. With a dark expression, he gestured to Amandina to follow him. Even though Amandina did not reply, she knew that it was pointless for her to resist, so she followed him silently. The two of them entered a study. Sorcerer Sadar did not speak, and took out a communication ruby from a drawer and rubbed it twice with his fingers. After about 15 minutes, there was a knock on the door. "Mr. Sadar." Amandina heard the voice and felt all the blood in her body rush to her brain. Even though she had expected it, she could not help but tremble in anger. Sorcerer Sadar knocked on the table and the door opened by itself. Amandina raised her head and looked at the person outside. Her gaze was like two sharp swords that pierced towards the person. The person outside the door did not expect to meet such a terrifying gaze, and could not help but take a step back. But when he saw who the owner of the gaze was, his expression changed. "Why is it you?" "Who is she?" Before Amandina could say anything, Sadar, who already had a bad premonition, spoke first. He sat motionless in his seat, his face dark and gloomy to the point of being frightening. The person who came was Makarov. This was the confidant of the royal faction, the cunning fox of Lantan Island, the confidant of the Grand Duke of Carnot. The traitor was wearing a gray-black fur coat. The hat on his head was covered with dew, rain and snow, and his boots were covered with half-dried mud. He looked like he had just arrived at Lighthouse not long ago and had not had time to rest after a long journey. Amandina looked at his pitiful appearance and sneered in her heart. The dignified minister of Erwin's court was acting so carefully, wagging his tail and begging for mercy. Did he look like the leader of the royal faction at all? Was this the lifelong pursuit of this man? Indeed, he got what he asked for. "My lord, there's a problem." Makarov knew what Amandina's gaze meant, but he ignored it and answered respectfully, "This is not the princess, she is the mistress of Count Tanajal. She is also a powerful woman." "I didn't expect you to be such a despicable person, Makarov." Amandina looked at the traitor and said coldly, "You betrayed the princess and slandered the relationship between my lord and myself. Do you think everyone is as filthy as you? How dare you call her princess?" Makarov was about to retort, but Sorcerer Sadar shouted angrily, "All of you shut up." He suddenly stretched out his hand, and a bolt of lightning shot out from his fingertips and struck Amandina's chest. Amandina screamed in pain as she crashed into a bookshelf. She felt a sharp pain in her back as the bookshelf fell on top of her, and the books fell heavily on top of her, burying her under them. Blood gushed out from all over her body, and there was a salty taste in her mouth. She coughed weakly and felt like she was about to faint. But she heard Sorcerer Sadar's voice from outside, "You better give me an explanation, Makarov." My lord." Makarov suppressed his uneasiness and tried to explain. "I don't quite understand. My subordinates were the ones who captured her, but the item was given to me. Do you think my subordinates dared to lie to me?" Wizard Sadar sat in his seat, his gloomy face like a dark cloud that was brewing a storm. "Now that we've captured her, you're telling me she's not the princess?" "My lord, I understand." Makarov gulped and racked his brains to understand the problem. "Can I see it?" Sorcerer Sadar snorted coldly and tossed a gemstone to Makarov. It was the Gorlin gemstone that was used to verify Amandina's bloodline when she was captured by the Banksians. Makarov silently took the gemstone and examined it carefully. This gemstone was originally a part of the Lionheart sword. It was embedded in the hammer of the sacred sword by the first generation of swordsmiths as a symbol of Erwin's authority. Later, during the Battle of Balta, the jewel was lost from the sword, and the knights only found it a year later. After that, the late King Eric used it to make a crown, which has been the treasure of House Cipher ever since. After the fall of House Cipher, this crown naturally fell into the hands of House Covardo. Its last owner was King Oberg VII. Before this muddle-headed king died, he entrusted the crown to the royal faction for safekeeping. In fact, this crown had always been in the hands of Makarov and Oberway. Makarov carefully examined the gemstone that emitted a bright light. He flipped it over and over for a long time, but he could not figure out what was wrong with it. He swore that this gemstone was the real Gorlin gemstone, but why would there be such a problem? After a while, the traitor raised his head in confusion while holding the gem. Looking at his expression, Sorcerer Sadr knew that it was a waste of time. "Are you trying to say that I made a mistake?" "My lord, Makarov broke out in cold sweat. He might be someone important in Erewhon, but he was nothing in front of the people of House Cypher. Just as he was about to find an excuse to explain himself, a hoarse sneer came from under the overturned bookshelf. "Mr. Sorcerer, why are you letting him continue to deceive you?" Makarov subconsciously turned his head around. He saw the bookshelf being pushed open by a pair of weak arms. A young girl covered in wounds struggled to get up from below. Books and debris fell from her body like rain, but in the end the young girl staggered to her feet. She looked at the two people in the room, and her gaze finally landed on Sorcerer Sadr. "My lord, Makarov realized that something was wrong and quickly spoke. But Sorcerer Sadr was expressionless, and even the anger on his face disappeared. "Let her continue." Makarov could only obediently shut his mouth, but his expression was one of anger. "Give me the gemstone." Amandina did not intend to let him go and coldly looked at the traitor. "The Gorlin gemstone is Erewhon's sacred item. How can it be given to a traitor like you? What are you trying to do?" Makarov felt that something was wrong. Amandina did not answer him and only looked at Sorcerer Sadr. "Give it to her." Sorcerer Sadr replied as expected. "My lord, be careful, she might break the gemstone." "Give it to her," Sorcerer Sadr emphasized. Makarov had no choice but to do as he was told. He was known as the cunning fox of Lantan Island, but even the most cunning fox would not dare to act rashly in front of a real lion. Even though he had a stomach full of tricks, they were useless here. Amandina took the gemstone, and the seemingly ordinary Gorlin gemstone immediately bloomed with light the moment it touched her hand. When the gemstone was stained with her blood, it suddenly shone brightly. It was as if a ball of fire had lit up in the center of the gemstone. It slowly expanded outwards and finally became bright and flawless, emitting a gentle light in all directions. The girl held the gemstone with both hands, and it was as if she was holding up the sun. The dazzling light shone in all directions, and Makarov did not dare to look at it directly. Even Sorcerer Sadr, who was not far away, could not help but squint his eyes. "This?" Makarov was dumbfounded. He covered his eyes with his hands and shouted, "How is this possible?" But Sorcerer Sadr was much calmer, and he only looked at Amandina thoughtfully. Amandina put down the gemstone, and as if it was her will, the light from the gemstone gradually faded with her movements. She raised her head and looked straight into Sorcerer Sadr's eyes. Her expression was calm as she said, "The person you found is not reliable at all. He doesn't even understand the true meaning of the Gorlin gemstone, and he actually tried to use it to find Princess Griffin. What a joke." After saying this, Amandina closed her mouth. She only waited in silence. But in her heart, she was extremely nervous. She was gambling, but if she guessed wrong she would die immediately. Fortunately, she did not make a mistake on the crucial point. "Don't try to sow discord," Sadr said coldly. "No matter what you know, little girl, you can only live if you prove your worth." "What I mean is," Amandina was unmoved and replied with the same indifference, "you have found the wrong person. Even though the House of Kovardo rules Erewhon today, they are still usurpers." At this moment, Makarov finally recovered from his shock. When he heard this sentence, an almost non-existent possibility flashed through his mind. "Wait, you mean?" Amandina looked at him with some disgust. She reached out and pulled out a necklace from her neck. The necklace that had lost its pendant lightly swayed in her hand, and shone under the afternoon sun. "Do you recognize this, Mr. Cunning Fox?" Cypher's heart. Makarov almost took a step back. You are the heir to the House of Cypher?" "Wait a moment," Sadr suddenly interrupted the two of them impatiently. "What is this? You said that she is also an heir to the House of Kovardo. Do you mean that there are more than two heirs to the House of Kovardo? But this does not match the information I received." "My lord, that is not the case." Makarov did not dare to delay and quickly explained the history of Erewhon. Only then did he explain why there were two royal bloodlines in this kingdom. He talked about the Battle of Grey Mountain, the change of the House of Kovardo, and the rise of the House of Covardo. Sadr finally stopped him impatiently and waved his hand. All right, I am not interested in these trivial matters, and I don't care how many kings were born in this small place. In fact, this is only a question for you. Does this little girl meet the requirements? Makarov was stunned for a moment. He then awkwardly replied, My lord, if what she said is true, then I think she should meet the requirements. The sacred Lionheart sword was originally wielded by the late King Eric, and he was the ancestor of House Cipher. This girl is a direct descendant of Elkin III. Compared to the current House of Cipher, this branch has more legitimacy to inherit the throne. Get to the point, Sadr said. In other words, even if we find the princess, it is very likely that it will be a waste of time. Makarov could only brace himself and explain, My lord, I am only saying that there is a possibility. As one of the leaders of the Silver Confederation, Sadr was not fooled by his words and sneered, If that's the case, then shouldn't I be thanking you for your lucky shot? Makarov broke out in cold sweat and could not say the second half of his sentence. However, Sadr shook his head. He would not make a mountain out of a molehill over such a small matter. He knew that a truly reliable person would not betray their own beliefs so easily. Only these despicable people would side with them for the slightest benefit. But without these idiots, where would the Sassel's lackeys come from? He knew the relationship between the two of them, but he did not show it. He looked at Amandina again and sized her up. He did not care who she was. She was just a commoner's heir. This kind of status was not worth mentioning in the eyes of the Sassels. It was fine as long as she could use the sword. Sadr used the slow and leisurely tone of a magus and said, You have proven your worth, little girl. Now tell me about your background. Amandina looked at the two people in the room and was silent for a moment. When Makarov told her about the history of Erewhon, her heart was filled with disgust. The history of this ancient kingdom was a source of glory to some, but to others, it was just a stepping stone that could be sold at any time. What these people trampled on was not only their own beliefs and ideals, but also the blood and sacrifice of others. Perhaps they were not even worthy of such a title. But she had already come this far. Even if it was her, she could only persevere. Amandina looked at the necklace in her hand and said softly, According to the royal family's genealogy, my original name should be Moria Elena de Cipher. My ancestor was the last king of the Cipher dynasty, Elkin III. After the Battle of Grey Mountain, my father's grandfather brought them and fled from Cipher. After that, our branch settled down in the south. My father's grandfather had a son and a daughter. The daughter's branch lost contact with the Bloodstaff when they invaded Karsuk, and we are the descendants of the other branch. After the Age of Chaos, we settled down in the area from Ranner to Grinoires. We tried our best to maintain our status as nobles until my father's generation fell. But even though we have lost our status as nobles according to the oath our clan made, I cannot abandon my ancient name. Even if my name is Amandina today, my other name will follow me for life. Sorcerer Sadr nodded in satisfaction. This is a good story, he said. I believe you will be grateful for your frankness. Otherwise, I would have turned you into a piece of charcoal a few minutes ago. In this world, only those who can prove their worth can survive. Even the Sassels are the same. The leader of the Bugas clapped his hands, his slender and pale fingers overlapping. He seemed to be in a good mood. After listening to your story, it's time to listen to our story. I hope this story will give you some inspiration. He raised his hand and chanted an ancient and mysterious incantation. Several shadows overlapped in the air. Light and shadow weaved together and finally formed a long sword. Sorcerer Sadr stood up and pointed at the sword with his hand. I think you should recognize this sword, Miss Amandina. No, I should say Princess Moria. Of course Amandina recognized the sword. Because it was the symbol of Erewhon. It was also the symbol of House Cipher. It was the Lionheart sword. Chapter 15:11. With a wave of his hand, the Lionheart sword fell from the sky and landed in his hand. He raised the sword and looked at it carefully. The afternoon sun passed through the gaps between the blinds, forming a narrow strip of light that fell on the blade. The bright blade shone with a dazzling luster. After looking at it for a while, Sadr said, This sword was the sword of the Lionheart King Eric when he was alive. Legend has it that this sword symbolizes ideals, and it will choose those who have the same noble beliefs as its master. But few people know that this sword was forged from the fragments of the holy sword Oderfeis. The soul of the holy sword lies in the sword. Its first master was the chief of the Knight of Flame, and the ancestor of the late King Eric. About 7 centuries ago, This sword was lost in the hands of the cruise people and came to this barren land in the south. But it wasn't as described in history, where the late King Eric stole this sword from the cruise people. It was more like a will left behind by the Flame King before he died. The establishment of Erwin and the interference of the Wind Elves were all for the purpose of covering up a bigger secret. As he spoke, he turned the blade and placed the Lionheart sword back on the table. And this sword is the key to that secret. After he finished speaking, Satyr raised his head and looked at Amandina. His gaze was like a sword, but Amandina only frowned slightly. Her face did not change at all. In her heart there was a different scene. She could still vaguely remember the scene of that summer night. The light of the Witch Queen shone brightly and covered the sky above the south. A bright belt of light stretched across the center of the night. Stars weaved together, and billions of stars fell from the sky, as if they shone into the deepest part of her memory. It was her own courtyard, and the sparkling Bragg's River in the distance. "Father, is that sword really that powerful?" "Of course," Viscount Nesson smiled and patted his daughter's head. "So Annie, you have to grow up quickly." "Why?" Viscount Nesson smiled and did not speak. He patted his daughter's head again, and the latter angrily pushed away her father's hand. "Annie." Viscount Nesson remembered something. "Do you remember what I told you yesterday?" "Yes, I remember. Grandfather said that we are the descendants of Elkin III, the heirs of the House of Cipher. My real name is Moria Adalina de Cipher." Viscount Nesson smiled and patted her shoulder. "You must remember that although you may never use this name in your life, the blood of the late King Eric that flows in our veins determines the responsibility we bear for this kingdom." "Responsibility?" "That is, one day when Awi needs us to stand up for her, I hope that you will be brave." "I will be brave." The little girl's eyes twinkled. "Daddy." "Okay." Viscount Nesson laughed. "Let's go. Mother is calling us." "All right, when we have time I will bring you to the villa in the suburbs to play." "Really?" "Of course I'll keep my word." "But I didn't keep my word." Amandina bit her lip. In her memory, not long after that, her family sold off their property. Life seemed to have become poor all of a sudden, and that promise could no longer be fulfilled. She waited for a very long time. Her father disappeared, and her mother washed her face with tears. She became thinner day by day, and it was not until many years later that another man helped her fulfill her wish. But the courtyard in her childhood memories no longer existed. Sorcerer Sadr looked suspiciously at the complicated expression on the girl's face and asked, "What are you thinking about?" Amandina's dark eyes became clear again and gradually became firm. She recovered from her memories and slowly shook her head. "It's nothing, just some memories about this sword, sir." "What is it?" "My lord, you should understand the significance of this sword to the descendants of House Cipher." Sadr understood and nodded. "It's fine. We can give this sword to you, little girl." Amandina did not reply. She knew that these two would not be so kind. As expected, she heard Sadr continue. "But we must obtain the secret behind this sword. It has nothing to do with House Cipher. This sword is actually a key. Only a true descendant of the Erwin royal family can hold it and open that door." He paused and continued. "As a direct descendant of King Eric, I think you will not disappoint us, right?" Amandina was silent for a moment. Either join or die. This was indeed a simple choice. For a long time she did not say a word. She only silently looked at the sword. Sadr was not in a hurry. He waited for her answer without saying a word, as if he already had a card up his sleeve. After a moment, Amandina finally raised her head and answered word by word. "I understand. As a direct descendant of King Eric, I will not disappoint you." The girl said this with great seriousness. Unfortunately, Sadr and Makarov did not understand. The former's fingers caressed the smooth blade of the Lionheart's sacred sword. Then he raised the sword and handed it over to her. But Amandina did not reach out to take it. "This is your only chance, little girl," Sadr threatened with a gloomy expression. "Take this sword or you will leave this place." Amandina looked at him. "Yes," she said, "but I have a request." This request made Sadr pause for a moment. But after a moment of hesitation he nodded. Since this human girl had chosen to submit, he did not want to complicate matters at this time. "I want to know about you," Amandina asked. Sadr frowned. "Don't you think you're asking for too much, little girl?" "I think this is a reasonable request, my lord," Amandina replied calmly. "I have already proven my worth, but I know nothing about you." "That's true." Sorcerer Sadr nodded. He liked dealing with smart people, especially sensible people. He felt that he was beginning to admire this little girl. Alright, this can be considered an exception. What do you want to know? He replied. About the Twilight Dragon. Sadr sucked in a breath of cold air. Amandina was unmoved and continued. The plan in Erewhon is not just a game for the Sithardians, right? I don't want to be treated as the lowest chess piece. Sorcerer Sadr gave the little girl a deep look. This question did not cross his bottom line, but it was beyond his expectations. He did not know what Amandina was thinking, but he thought that she had foresight. He subconsciously looked at Makarov, and his heart was filled with disappointment. How could there be such a huge gap between people? It was not that Makarov was not cunning enough, but the level of thinking had determined many things. Interesting, Wizard Sadr muttered. But there was nothing to hide. The Sithardians had done such a big thing and there was no way to hide it. He paced back and forth on the spot before speaking. Actually, the contact between the Sithardians and the Twilight Dragon is much closer than you think. About 45 years ago, a black dragon called Gwendolyn came to us. She first stayed in Oleg for 3 days, then went to Augusta. Haryanov and I met the black dragon there. Not long after that, the Sithardians had a new goal, and parted ways with their former comrades. The Dragon Queen? Amandina asked. Sorcerer Sadr nodded slowly. A trace of doubt flashed through the girl's heart. In just 3 days you betrayed the entire Silver City because of the dragon's words. I'm not stupid, Lord Sadr. You overestimate it, Sadr sneered. Even without this fuse, the split was only a long-term inevitable result. The origin of the name Sithardian was originally a noble, a ruler, and a keeper of mysteries and knowledge. We were never on the same side as the inferior wizards of the Silver Society. There were nobles among the Bugas? There were indeed such nobles before the era of the Azure Knight. Sadr's tone was a little nostalgic. Amandina tilted her head. But the Twilight Dragon's goal is to destroy our world. You should know that. What can you gain by cooperating with it? That's the story the Holy Cathedral told you, little girl? Sorcerer Sadr smiled contemptuously. They're always so alarmist, hoping to scare the world into blindly following their rule. He put down the Lionheart sword and gestured a rune with his hand. The end of the Twilight Dragon is not so much destruction, but rather turning the world back to its original state. On the other hand, Martha's creation is also a twilight for the people of chaos. Unfortunately, we are not the people of chaos, Amandina said sarcastically. We can't think with their eyes. You can say that. Sadr spread his hands, not caring about the girl's tone. But no matter what, destruction is a serious word, so please don't use it lightly. If we can't surpass the dimension of our existence, we can't destroy the universe of this dimension. The Twilight Dragon can't do that. In fact, we prefer to use tearing down an old house as an analogy for what is happening. He made an analogy. The only thing that will be destroyed in this war is the Tiamat code created by the divine people. Tearing down an old house. A hint of anger flashed in Amandina's eyes. But what difference does it make? Without this world that Marcia cares for, when the physical world disintegrates, all existences will lose their support. How can you all be lucky enough to be spared? If everything is lost in the end, what's the point of gaining so much now? This is the root of the contradiction. Sadr's tone was unusually calm. What you said applies to most people. But there is another possibility. The chaos is not really nothingness. As long as we can transcend the existing life forms, we can obtain immortality in another sense. In other words, become a part of the Twilight Dragon? Aren't the demons a part of the Twilight Dragon? Amandina felt a wave of disgust at this logic, but she did not dare to refute and could only keep her mouth shut. Sadr looked at her expression and guessed what she was thinking. He could not help but snort coldly. You still don't seem to understand, do you? This is actually a mortal's perspective. You look at this problem from the perspective of the weak, and naturally empathize with the weak. But what do those people have to do with you? He taught Amandina. Your way of thinking is not a wise way of thinking. This is a world of survival of the fittest. We can survive, but some people must be eliminated. But this is not because of us, it is because they are too weak. We can choose to save them or we can choose not to save them, but this is not a moral necessity for us. We have no necessary responsibility for these people. Amandina was silent for a moment. But the Bugas are also a member of this world. She tried to control her tone, but there was still a faint trace of anger. You seize power from this world, and part of this power itself belongs to others. So you are strong and some people will be weak because of you. Our ancestors have agreed to protect this world together, but now you are on the side of the Twilight Dragon. How is this not a responsibility? Protect together? Sorcerer Sadr smiled mockingly and interrupted her. I have to point out that the last internal conflict in the mortal world ended 70 days ago. Even if we didn't intervene, when have you ever truly taken responsibility for this world, in the past 1,000 years? That's because the mortals don't know anything about it. Amandina pursed her lips and suppressed her somewhat impulsive tone with difficulty. If it weren't for the magic tide, we wouldn't even know that the Twilight Dragon was about to awaken. And the Bugas have sealed everything about the past so tightly. Shouldn't they be responsible for this? Sorcerer Sadr laughed coldly. You mean to say that we have an undeniable responsibility for your tragic situation? We have never asked for anything from you, but at least it's not a knife in the back. Amandina was furious as well. The Bugas had once overthrown the Myurnas with the mortals, but the Silver Folk had also taken away most of the heritage from the era of the gods and claimed to be the heirs of this heritage. They sealed the knowledge and secrets of the past in their ivory towers and used this knowledge and secrets to build today's kingdom above the clouds. The mortals, on the other hand, were like inferior people who were born to roll in the mud. When the Silver Folk re-established their glorious kingdom in just 100 years, the mortals were still struggling on the continent, trying to establish their own kingdom. So the crews, Fanzan and Saint Tossol that the world knew today were not the crews of the Myurnas, nor were they the Fanzan of the Myurnas or the Saint Tossol of the Myurnas. They were the faint light of civilization that the mortals had accumulated over 1,000 years like dripping water penetrating a stone. But although the hope was slim, it still persisted tenaciously. The reason why Tumen could be respected by the 4 holy cathedrals as their teacher was not only because he had taught the saints. It was also because he had given the Iron Folk of the era after the Myurnas the most precious wealth, knowledge. It was a precious treasure that even the Bugas, the allies of the mortals, cherished and carefully protected. These were the Iron Folk. They were the mortals. They inherited the name of Black Iron. This cheap, lowly, flawed, and unaesthetic metal seemed to be born at the bottom, the most inconspicuous existence, but it had only one advantage: gold was too precious. Silver was too weak. Only Black Iron was resilient. It was so ubiquitous that there was no need to be careful. It was so lowly and unaesthetic that it was not tainted with those arrogant qualities, and its simplicity and unpretentiousness would eventually be cast into a silent note that would completely end this era. It was a weak power of billions, but more dazzling than any name written in the epics. At that moment, Amandina finally understood Brando's choice. She also understood her own choice. She shook her head slightly. I understand. Sorcerer Sadr stopped. Amandina raised her head and looked at him. Sathard has made the right choice, let us fulfill the rest of the agreement. Makarov looked at the girl strangely from the side, feeling a little uneasy. But he did not dare to speak when he saw Sadr's expression. This was a cunning fox of the kingdom. The other person was a rising star of Tanajal. These two could be said to be the 2 most intelligent people in Erewhon in this era. But a person could only lock his own thoughts with heavy shackles. The other person ignited all the flames of his wisdom, causing everything to burn fiercely, turning into a flame that engulfed everything. At this moment, courage could be the entirety of wisdom. But wisdom was only the tip of the iceberg. Sorcerer Sadr nodded. Very well, let's return to the main topic, we have wasted too much time. He picked up the Lionheart again, but before he passed it to Amandina, the leader of the Sadrs looked at her solemnly. The people of the 9 Phoenix always say unpleasant things first, and I am the same, little girl. Smart people should know how to avoid harm, and you should understand what it means to be deceived. I understand. That's good, Sorcerer Sadr said coldly. But I still have to remind you. Do you see the sword in my hand? It's the symbol of this kingdom, and just like it, you have to understand that I'm not only holding your life in my hands, but also the future of this kingdom. I don't think you want to see too many people die for you, do you? Amandina's face was a little pale. But she still nodded. Sadr nodded as well, and only then did he reverse the blade and push it forward. The Lionheart swayed as it flew towards Amandina. Then he pointed to the sword floating in the air and said to her, That's right. Now pick it up. Now pick it up. It was a simple choice. But Amandina stood there for a long time, staring at the sword. It was like a distant dream. The sword was vaguely different from her father's description in her memory, but only the emblem on the sword still described its past, as if time had left a mark on it. Very few people knew the secret of the sword. But the descendants of the late King Eric were an exception. That voice echoed in her mind. Annie, when Erewhon needs us to stand up for him, I hope you will be brave. "I will, father." Amandina took a deep breath and lifted her head to look at Sorcerer Sadr. Her eyes flashed with the brightest light. Wait, stop. When he saw the pair of firm and determined eyes, he finally realized that something was wrong. Even under Sadr's gaze he could not help but shout. But it was too late. Amandina's hand lightly grasped the hilt of the sword. Farewell, Brando. Chapter 15:12. By the name of Martha, Pamed, I'm going to be a father. Borg Nesson waved the letter in his hand excitedly. Oh, is that so? A smile appeared on the stern knight's old-fashioned face. He looked at his companion with his light brown eyes. Then I must congratulate you properly. Of course. Borg Nesson sat down next to his colleague and gazed at the Nysender forest under the evening mist. Under the setting sun, a bronze-colored neem tree stood tall in the canopy, and a star crow was building its nest in the umbrella-shaped canopy. Occasionally, it would stop and stare at the two uninvited guests with its beady black eyes. It's so beautiful, Erwin. I can't get enough of it. This is our country. Indeed, it's more comfortable to be back in Erwin, the knight replied. Following a crow's caw, a flock of birds flew up from the forest. The sound of their wings flapping could be heard from miles away. A large animal passed through the forest. The knight turned around to warn the others behind him. But Borg Nesson interrupted him. Hey, don't change the subject. It's still far away. He patted his companion's shoulder. Let's talk about you. You're not married yet, right? My goodness, poor old Pamed must be worried sick. So, have you taken a fancy to any lucky girl? The knight glanced at him calmly. Didn't I say that I won't think about it until I find out the truth? Borg Nesson's eyes widened. You're making us blush with shame. You know that you're the only bachelor left among us. As for me, not only do I have a beautiful and kind wife, I might even have a daughter. Are you looking down on us? You're different, the knight replied. You were already engaged before you left Erwin. I don't have so many restrictions. That's not a restriction, Borg Nesson corrected his companion's incorrect view. The knight shrugged. Borg Nesson was silent for a moment before he became serious. But have you thought it through, Pamed? We've made almost no progress in the past 10 years. The matter that the Marshal asked us to investigate in private is not simple. You have to think about it carefully. 1,000 years have passed since the War of the Holy Saints. Even if Lady Martha really left us some clues, they may have been erased by time. Haven't you noticed that we can't move an inch after returning to Erwin? If what your Highness saw is true, then no matter how difficult it is, someone has to persevere, right? The knight reached out his hand and clawed into the distance. For this beautiful scenery to continue to exist, for everyone's tomorrow to not be meaningless, everything is to change that predetermined fate. Can mere mortals really change anything? Is Lady Martha joking? Borg Nesson smiled bitterly. Haven't you noticed that Her Highness doesn't seem to believe in this either? In fact, I think it's more reliable to unite with the Silver Folk. Her Highness may have other ideas. You should have noticed that. She's a very opinionated person, and now she's the Empress of the Cruz Empire. Perhaps in her opinion, those decisions about the past were indeed a little hasty. Even if it's Lady Martha, she dares to question it, the knight replied. But we're different. Borg Nesson shook his head. We have to believe in the Marshal's judgment. Do you? Of course, he replied without hesitation. The Marshal has never been wrong. The Marshal already has a descendant, the knight replied. He was born in Brags 2 years ago. It's his grandson. Haha, then I must beg the Marshal to betroth my daughter to this boy. According to the agreement, he's the next heir of the Cardoloso family. Just like the Marshal, he must be a genius. The knight shook his head. However, he was happy to see that the topic had been changed. Let's get down to business. Borg Nesson saw that his colleague was not in a good mood and knew what he was thinking. He changed the topic. Don't you think it's strange? It's a little strange, the knight replied. Yes. Our investigation first started in the Alcash area, and the investigation was limited to Cruz. But why did all the clues point to Erwin in the end? 1,000 years ago, this place was clearly not a barren land, right? But perhaps in an earlier era, there were traces of civilization here. Have you ever been to the Loop of Trade Winds? Are you talking about the Druids? Perhaps even earlier. Borg Nesson frowned. That still doesn't explain the other problem. Why do all the clues seem to be cut off here? We know that the Flame King asked the late King Eric to bring the sacred sword of fire to this land, but everything that happened 700 years ago is like a legend. There are no written records at all. Perhaps there are, but it's not in our hands. What do you mean? The knight pointed at the ground. The cultists. Ha, are you talking about those bastards we just slaughtered? But that's just a coincidence. Why would you suspect these people? It's not a coincidence, the knight replied. I've checked the files of the Holy Cathedral and found that their activities in Erewhon are much more frequent than we thought. So what? Do you still remember where we were 15 years ago? Borg Nessen's expression changed. He seemed to recall that nightmare, the endless pursuit, walking on the edge of death, poisoning, framing, and all kinds of conspiracies. He did everything he could to get away with it. That nightmare happened in Cruz, and it was probably one of the experiences he did not want to recall in his life. You mean the East Mets? The tree herders preserved a complete organization there, which is extremely rare in other places. I've carefully checked the local history of Mets for the past 30 years and found that the cultists' activities there are very similar to those in Erewhon. What does that mean? Do you still remember what they were looking for? You mean those strange stone pieces? That piece of stone came from Alcash about 30 years ago, Lucian explained. Borg Nessen felt as if he had been stabbed by a foot. Why didn't you say so earlier? Did someone else bring something else out of the Holy Cathedral? Did someone else enter the underground Holy Cathedral other than us? But how is that possible? The knight did not answer the question. Borg Nessen scratched his head. Why didn't you tell the princess back then? Maybe the tree herders wouldn't have taken the stone piece away in advance. Now those guys might have fled north to Fanzan. What should we do? Have you ever wondered why the tree herders were able to get the information in advance under such circumstances? Only you, the princess, and I know about the operation? The knight asked. You suspect the princess? I'm suspicious of the black dragons around her. Borg Nessen was silent. You think those stone pieces are clues? It's just a possibility. The knight answered. Also, those stone pieces don't exist alone. There should be another one in Metz and the rest are in Erewhon. In Erewhon? Borg Nessen exclaimed in a low voice. How can you be sure? The cultists told me themselves. Didn't I just say it? Borg Nessen frowned. I know that there are 2 stone pieces in Metz. The captured tree herders admitted it themselves. But it's just your guess about Aween. Isn't it too hasty to confirm this based on the frequency of the cultists' activities here? Don't our investigation leads to Erewhon too? Borg Nessen was silent. That's not good news. This time we don't have the princess behind us. Bad news is better than no news at all. But this time we're more prepared than the last time. Well, let's imagine. This means that they might have been following the Holy Sword of Flame since the time of the late King Eric. This is not surprising. After all, these people are the pawns of the Twilight Dragon. But the question is, Borg Nessen said, what should we do? It's simple. Since the cultists have spent more time than us, we'll look for clues from them, the knight replied. Borg Nessen looked at him in shock. After a while, he slowly sighed and said, You're really a genius, my friend, but this will be dangerous. Marshall's attendant knight and student, how can they be afraid of danger? Borg Nessen replied. I think your idea will work. Why don't we divide the work now? How? Borg Nessen continued. The cultists active in Erewhon are mainly the All for One and the Tree Herders. These 2 organizations are at odds with each other, so it's best for us to investigate them separately. I have a preliminary idea. All for One will be in your hands and the Tree Herders will be in mine. The knight looked up and silently glanced at his companion. Borg, although All for One is better at disguising themselves, the Tree Herders are much more organized. According to our strength— Stop, Borg Nessen hurriedly interrupted him. I'm his lordship's student. You have to let me do something, right? The knight was silent for a moment and nodded. The setting sun in Erewhon was slowly sinking below the Greyhill Mountains, and darkness gradually engulfed the earth. But the stars had risen, shining in the night sky. The Lionheart sword was born in the time of the late King Eric. 700 years later, the sword was once again in the hands of the descendants of the Lionheart king. Amandina silently looked at the sword in her hand. Since the sacred sword could no longer carry the ideals and bring light to this kingdom, then at least its power could not be in the hands of the Sassalds and lead this ancient kingdom to destruction. It was born of the sages and established this kingdom that carried the glory and oath. Then its destruction might be destined to give people the last hope. The cycle of history ended here. The sword was born because of Cypher, and it also died because of Cypher. She held the sword and decided to use this ancient family name to fulfill this promise. She raised the sword and a comforting smile appeared on her face. She looked up, and her bright eyes were like the light of a sword, piercing straight towards the despicable traitor. Makarov subconsciously took a step back. "What are you doing? Put it down." Sadr had already realized that something was wrong. He suddenly shot out from his position, his pale claw-like hands curled up as he muttered an incantation. Purple lightning shot out from the necklace in front of his chest. But the power of the sword had already merged into the blood of House Cypher. In Amandina's inky black eyes, the needle of time was slowing down. She saw the traitor's eyes widen. The muscles on his face went from relaxed to tense. Then he slowly opened his mouth and revealed his teeth. Every detail was clear to her. He slowly raised his hand like a dying old man and placed it in front of his chest bit by bit. This simple action seemed to have taken a century. Wizard Sadr opened his fingers, and lightning extended from his fingertips bit by bit. It did not look like quick light but more like paint that had been knocked over. Purple and silver mixed together and slowly soaked into the canvas, moving forward inch by inch. The whole world seemed to be frozen. Amandina saw the chair that Sadr had knocked over seemed to be suspended in the air. The four legs of the chair were lifted off the ground and slowly tilted in the air. A book called Manual's Botany was lifted off the table and fell to the ground in a visible trajectory. The process was extremely slow. She then lowered the sword behind her. The sword in her hand slowly swung backwards, and then drew an arc from bottom to top. When the arc returned to its original position, the sword flew out of her hand. Makarov did not react at all. Sorcerer Sadr's mouth opened and closed as he chanted, but he suddenly stopped. The fury on his face gradually turned into shock, and his hands stopped moving. A bright white line was reflected in his eyes, and it passed by him. Makarov did not react at all. That second was divided into countless moments. But only one white light pierced through the center of the room. It pierced through Makarov's chest without any resistance. Time resumed its normal flow. Sadr turned around and saw the pure and flawless sword light cut open Makarov in front of him. The traitor did not even have time to cry out. His expression of fear, unwillingness, pain, and regret froze in the last moment, and then he melted into a pure white flame. Some of them had the chance to go down in history and be remembered by the people of Aween. But he chose a different path. This path led to his final death in the flames. After the Lionheart sword pierced through the traitor of the royal faction, it continued to move forward and hit a metal astronomical instrument on the desk. Under Sadr's shocked and angry gaze, the sacred sword of Erewhon was broken like glass. The blade broke into countless small fragments and flew in all directions. "No!" he roared, and his hair stood on end. The anger in his heart almost burned the entire lighthouse to ashes. He seemed to see the illusion of the Twilight Dragon in front of him, looking at him with a cold smile. Behind it was the destruction of the Sossalts. And the end of the world. "No!" Sorcerer Sadr screamed again, his heart aching. He couldn't understand how a saint's sword could be broken so easily. And even with the power of the Silver Folks, there was nothing they could do to save him this time. The Lionheart sword did indeed hide a secret that no one knew. But it was a legend that only the descendants of House Cypher knew. The purple lightning struck Amandina at the same time. The power close to that of a sage almost tore the girl's mortal body apart in an instant. It was a story about faith and dignity. Although it was weak. But it was destined not to be manipulated by fate. No matter what it took. The choice of the humble was like the sword in the girl's hand. It was better to die in glory than to live in dishonor. Amandina closed her eyes. But death did not come for a long time. She heard a gentle voice in her heart, calling out to her sleeping consciousness. "Annie, you've grown up." In the room. Sorcerer Sadr looked at the scattered fragments of the holy sword in shock. They gathered together and surrounded the human girl under the convergence of an invisible force. Sorcerer Sadr's power, as well as the power of all the elements and laws in the room, was swept away by this invisible force. A man and a woman, two figures flashed into the room one after another. She looked at him coldly, as if looking at a dead person. Chapter 15-13. When Amandina slowly opened her eyes, she found herself standing in a strange place. "Where is this place? Am I not dead?" She raised her hand hesitantly, slowly reaching for her cheek and pressing it, as if to confirm that she was not a ghost. In the distance, there was an endless basalt surface that stretched as far as the eye could see, and densely packed square mountains were stacked in layers. Green lightning shuttled through the clouds, and the strong wind blew her long hair, forcing her to use her hands to push back the hair that was blocking her eyes. She raised her head, lifted her tattered skirt and walked barefoot. She hesitated for a moment, but still walked forward resolutely. Dust and sand flew up in the wind, rolling over the girl's skirt. In the midst of the sandstorm, there was only a lonely figure staggering forward step by step. It was a vast and endless plain. In the cramped study, the fragments of the holy sword flew up from the ground one by one. Like sand in the wind, they flew up and circled around Miss Amandina. Brando, holding the holy sword Odorfice, was staring coldly at Wizard Sodder. Beside him, Freya clenched her fists so tightly that they were almost bloodless. She gritted her teeth and glared at the silver person wizard with red eyes. They were supposed to be the guardians of order, the bearers of the fire of civilization. Who are you people? Sorcerer Sodder looked at the two uninvited guests in shock and anger. Where were the guards? Where were the other Wizard Sodder in the castle? He stretched out his hand and the gray crystal staff, which had been leaning on the side and had never been used before, flew out of thin air and fell into his hand. The aura of the young man in front of him made his scalp tingle. Could it be that he had met a young dragon king? He opened his 5 fingers, not daring to hold back, and pointed the gray crystal staff in his hand at the two of them. Universe Singularity Imprisonment. This 11-circle spell was the supreme achievement of spatial magic. A singularity universe containing trillions of star systems slowly unfolded in space. A gust of wind rose in the room, and books and miscellaneous items flew into the four-sided void, followed by tables, chairs, cabinets, and bookshelves. In the end, even the ceiling of the room collapsed. The bricks and tiles broke free from the restraints of the walls and converged into a torrent that was sucked into the void. But Brando only punched. He didn't even use the golden flame holy sword Odorfice. He just transferred the sword from his right hand to his left hand, then raised his fist, and punched into the singularity universe, breaking it into pieces like a rag. The fist went straight through the void, and to Wizard Sodder's great astonishment, it hit him hard in the lower abdomen. The expression that was fixed on his face was a simple 4 words. This is impossible. Thus, one of the 12 leaders of the Buga Wizards, the Wizard King of Sarsard, only had time to let out a painful whimper, and his whole body flew out as if folded in half. He crashed into the wall behind him and the bricks and stones shattered. Brendel did not say a word. He stepped into the cloud of dust and reached under the rubble. With a whoosh, he lifted the dusty sorcerer Sodder out of the rubble. He asked word by word, "Now, do you still think mortals are weak?" Wizard Sodder, whose face was bruised and swollen, screamed. The power of the sage, you are the Silver Dragon King Rudian? Answer wrong. Brando lifted the leader of the wizards up high, and then threw him hard to the ground. With a loud bang, the poor Wizard King flew out like a rubber ball, smashing everything in his way into pieces. Fortunately, he was a silver person and in existence close to the sage, so he was not smashed to pieces. Even so, several bones were broken. Seeing this scene, even Freya couldn't help but let go of her hand. She had never seen Brando like this. Furious, cold, and merciless. But she didn't feel afraid at all. She only felt calm and warm. Because the anger in her heart came from the promise, which was the true pride of a man and a lord. Trampling on, Wizard Sodder spat out a big mouthful of blood before he got up from the ground, but he still didn't give up resisting. He reached out his hand again and grabbed his gray crystal staff from 10 feet away. He knew that he had met a formidable opponent this time. His opponent's power level seemed to be higher than his own. He racked his brains but could not figure out who his opponent was. It was not the Silver Dragon King Luodi, but who else could have such power? Of course, even in the most absurd of hypotheses, Wizard Sodder had never imagined that the opponent was the princess's knight, Count Randner, the lord of the Tonajal people, who was praised by the people of Erewhon. There was no other reason. It was just a mortal. But this mortal was destined to give him an unforgettable memory on this day. First it was Amandina. Now it was her lord. Sodder calmed down. After all, he had been through hundreds of battles and had even faced the man who made him tremble, the man called the Dark Dragon Odin. He raised his gray crystal staff and read out the taboo words recorded in the most ancient of documents. Wind, lightning, fire, and ice formed behind him one after another. He stretched out his thin fingers and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Die, elemental calamity." This was a spell invented by a dragon called Calamity. The blue Calamity, the elemental dragon. The 14th ring was the limit that all beings below the divine folk could reach. Forbidden spell. With the Sorcerer King's actions, even the ground within a few miles of the lighthouse trembled. The earth elemental was being sucked away. The ground from Winomar to Silman cracked, and the earth and rocks were overturned. The creatures that lived in the soil escaped from their nests in tens of thousands. The merchants on the road had no choice but to stop and watch this strange scene. A few miles away, the clouds in the sky gathered into a vortex. Wind and fire elemental were being sucked down from thousands of meters in the air, converging into a green pillar of light that surged towards the lighthouse below the vortex. The waves on Lake Valendon began to recede like a tsunami, revealing the bottom of the lake that was thousands of meters long. The water elemental was being sucked away from the physical world. The light of the four natural elements converged into a belt of light, slowly merging into the gray crystal of the staff in Sorcerer Soder's hand. Each of these light belts was several miles long. From afar they looked like intertwined clouds of various colors. And in the light of these colorful clouds, Sorcerer Soder's expression was twisted and ferocious. Brando also took a step back and used his hand to block in front of Freya. No matter what, he was still one of the 12 leaders of the Bugas. Although he was not one of the strongest, he was not to be underestimated. And this 14-circle spell was the best explanation of the opponent's strength. Brando? Freya hid behind him and asked worriedly. But she saw Brando only shake his head gently. Her heart calmed down. Sorcerer Soder had finished chanting the last spell. He raised his gray crystal staff. This was the second time in 1,000 years that he had cast this spell. He had seen this spell that was known as the most magnificent in the mortal world. Hundreds of miles of ice crystal storms, lightning and thunder, fire and wind that burned everything, and turned the entire Nestle swamp into ashes. The depths of his eyes reflected the color of fanaticism. The era where the Sassalds were restrained was over, and the Silver Folk would once again dominate the order of this land. Because only those who held such power were worthy of being called the true masters of Wond. But he did not finally see the flame that ignited the deepest part of his heart. Because the flame was extinguished. The wind stopped. The elemental water dried up. The restless land calmed down. The fanatical expression froze on Sorcerer Soder's face. Brando was also stunned. What was going on? He clearly felt that the magic in the space was rapidly disappearing, and the four elements that relied on it also lost their dependence. Brando, Freya suddenly pushed Brando's back and shouted, "Look at Amandina." He suddenly turned his head. The broken Lionheart sword was broken into a total of 27 pieces. At this moment they were circling around Amandina, and when each piece circled around her, a faint silver rune appeared. Every time the silver rune shone, a basic law was extracted from this space. Magic, elements, destruction, restraint. They are disintegrating Sorcerer Soder's forbidden spell. Freya was almost in disbelief. But how can the Lionheart sword do such a thing? Brando frowned and shook his head. He suddenly realized something and looked pitifully at Sorcerer Soder, who was kneeling on the ground with a dull expression, and then raised his head to look at the sky. There, the curling vortex of clouds had long disappeared, leaving only a clear blue sky. Brando replied softly, "Freya, that is not the power of the Lionheart sword." "Not the Lionheart sword?" He nodded. The young war god from Bucci looked at him in confusion. Brando silently reached out and held her cold hand. Freya was slightly stunned but did not pull her hand away. There was a strange feeling in her heart, as if she could feel the gentleness in this man's heart at this moment. It was an unspeakable feeling. It was silent, firm, and everywhere. It was a mother's care for her child. After tens of thousands of years, even if she had left this world long ago, she still firmly guarded this place. Compared to this, the despicableness of the Sasardians was not worth mentioning. That is Martha, in the sky. The slender silver thread was following the trajectory of the modern world and was being pulled out of this material world bit by bit. The magic power was being drawn out of Tiamat's network and was first stripped from the spell. Then the elements followed the contract between the four elemental kings and their mother and fled in all directions, turning into the most basic particles of the universe. Finally, it was the material world. The basic structure of the world was collapsing. The bricks, wooden beams, scattered pages, tables, and chairs were blown away by the wind like sand. In the blink of an eye, the castle turned into a pile of silver-gray gravel. At this moment, countless Sasardians were shocked to find that they had forever lost the ability to cast magic. On Silman Avenue a few miles away, merchants were enthusiastically discussing the sudden earthquake. Although some of them still had lingering fears, after the strange phenomenon in the sky disappeared, most of them had returned to their posts. Only a middle-aged man in ragged clothes who looked somewhat down and out was still frowning, silently watching the water not far away. The water was shaking slightly. "Aftershocks," he muttered. But the shaking was becoming more and more obvious. Some stones danced in a strange and rhythmic dance on the street. The people in the shops on both sides of the street cursed and ran out again. But this time the people were orderly. They even found something to cover their heads so that they would not be hurt by falling objects in the panic. The people stood on the street waiting for the aftershock to pass again. But the ground shook violently. Most of the people were thrown to the ground in an instant. The middle-aged man turned around and supported himself with one hand on a nearby tree. He turned his head and saw a few gray-robed Seville Silver Lily followers with dull expressions. Strong magic reaction. This is divine weapon reaction? I'm afraid it's more than that. In the crowd, a heart-wrenching scream suddenly rang out. "Look, Martha is up there, look over there." Everyone turned to look in the direction he was pointing. Then everyone felt their hair stand on end. In the distant horizon, a pure white beam of light. It shot from the bottom to the top, straight into the clouds, and above the clouds, there was a huge hand of light that gently caught the beam of light. Everyone's mouth was wide open, and they could not say a word for a long time. A few followers of the Silver Lily kept crossing themselves in front of their chests. Their hands were trembling a little. "Martha, Lady Martha." It was the reunion of a mother and her children after 12,000 years. At that moment many people actually started to wail loudly. The wind and sand formed a pillar. Once again Amandina tripped and fell on the hard rock. A layer of skin was scraped off her palms and knees and blood was dripping. But she did not say a word. She gritted her teeth and silently got up, trying to grab a sharp rock nearby to stand up again. But a hand appeared in front of her. Amandina raised her head in surprise. In front of her, a woman stood in the soft white light. She could not even see the woman's face clearly, but strangely she subconsciously felt warm and peaceful in her heart. The pursuit of ideals and beliefs is a long and difficult process. The woman smiled and stretched out her hand to her, saying, "What can truly lead to the final throne is not an external object, but a firm and unchanging belief." "You are. Don't you plan to continue moving forward, brave child?" Amandina gritted her teeth, nodded, and grabbed the woman's hand. She stood up. Looking back, the wind and sand that had filled the sky above the boundless basalt plains had already dissipated at some point. From afar she could see many people on the gray plains. Like her, they were trekking in the same direction. Amandina's mouth was slightly open. "Is this the kingdom of the dead?" The woman smiled slightly. "For those who pursue the truth, what's the difference between life and death?" The girl looked at her in confusion. "I once knew your father, Amandina." Looking at the girl's eyes widened in surprise, the woman said gently to her, "I know everyone who pursues hope. And your father's biological brother is perhaps the one you should be most proud of. You may not understand what kind of hope Mr. Borgnesen left for you." Chapter 15-14. The crystal clusters were like a purple tide, engulfing the last section of the gray city wall that stood in the middle of the tide. The countless crystal worms were like a huge wriggling mother body entrenched on the ground. The process of this mother body slowly engulfing everything was suffocating and despairing. Another flag disappeared in the purple sea. It was like a lonely sail that disappeared into the whirlpool, representing the annihilation of another army at the hands of the crystal clusters. In the tower, Hugh blocked the door and shouted to his commander in despair, "Sir Knight, we are surrounded." Shoo! Death seemed to be close at hand, but the female knight with a deep scar on her face quietly put a finger to her lips, signaling him to be quiet. She pointed above her head and said to the young knight, "Listen." The last fortress was in front of them. On the battlements, Veronica, Mangrove, Vala, the old prime minister, the Duke of Mehodafen, and Duke Ludwig looked grave. Below them, the crew's army's defense line was thinner than a piece of paper. But everyone was looking at the sky. The thick clouds were parting. A huge halo was slowly spreading out from the southern sky of the wilderness of 4 territories, pushing away the clouds within a radius of a few thousand miles. A few hundred miles away from Babel Fortress. Thousands of meters above the sea of clouds, after the Baravito broke through the clouds, it once again saw the Kurlutz, which also appeared at the other end of the cumulus clouds. Under the sun, on the 2 magnificent flagships, the commanders of the Hazel Army and the Cruz Army were looking at the wilderness of 4 territories below through the observation device. Both of them looked grave. Outside the Oro Forest, A huge black sphere stretched between the sky and the earth. Its lower part was suspended above the plains, and its middle part had already passed through the clouds. Countless flying dragons and beetles flew around the black sphere. From afar it looked like a few black dots. Below the black sphere, Camebell City was like a coin. There is the aura of a god. It is the dragon god Bahamut. This thing once defeated the allied army of the Green Army and the Black Army in the Metz area. There's someone in Camebell City. It looks like the Silver Bay Coalition army. How do we deal with this thing? We can only think of a way to attract its attention and buy some time for those poor fellows to evacuate. Give the order. However, the messenger's somewhat anxious voice came from the messaging crystal. Sir Commander, 10 seconds ago, there was a large amount of energy reaction in the southeast direction. Those things are rapidly approaching at a distance of 1,500 meters. They're very fast. They don't look like elven air cavalry. Alert. Wait, they're responding to us. It's the dragon race. Dragon race. She said she's the current princess of the dragon clan. Her name is Alaz. Alaz Golden Flame. A golden dragon? The dragon had arrived. The group of dragons was flying through the sky near Sobias. These giant beasts spread their wings and swept across the sky above the forest. The elves living in the forest all ran out of their tree houses as if they had seen the end of the world. They raised their heads and looked in the direction where the dragons had left with deep curiosity in their eyes. The dragons have appeared. What happened in the west? This was the year of the sword, the first day of the month of the winter harp. Many years later, the people of Saint-Tassol living in the White Mountain area would still remember this day. And that was also the last time people saw such a large-scale dragon migration on the continent of Wond. There were a total of 173 dragons. That was the last group that the dragons could gather after the disastrous defeat of Metz. Alas! The little female dragon suddenly heard Flora's voice. She turned around and saw the graceful silver dragon flying beside her. The silver dragon was a beautiful creature, and its mate was the pride of the entire silver dragon tribe. Look to the south. Alaz was stunned. She subconsciously turned her head in that direction. Grey Harbor, the capital of Yanalasu, refugees were crowded at the harbor. These people were poor people who gathered from Sylvanar or the Yenbao area further north. The sudden outbreak of war destroyed their originally peaceful lives. The rebel army began a massacre in the north, and the army of the No race did not let go of any villages they passed by. More and more people left their homeland out of fear and came to the south. But here, Grey Harbor was the end of their migration. The sea was full of ships that were preparing to leave, and each ship was full of people. The merchants were spontaneously dumping their goods in order to take more people with them. There was no return, and they did not care about their reputation. This was just a civilized creature taking the initiative to save themselves at the most critical moment. This was the biggest difference between human society and the beast. But there were still not enough ships. Erwin's air fleet also did not withdraw. The navy had not made a decision yet, but in any case, Count Yanalasa had to wait until the last ship left the harbor. This was the minimum promise that the soldiers made to the citizens they protected. The harbor was also full of all kinds of giant sea monsters. They were actually the servants of the Grey Fin Naga. The refugees boarded the backs of these giant beasts with fear and nervousness, but everyone who left the harbor on the giant beasts bent down and bowed respectfully in the direction of the lighthouse. There, the Frost Dew Queen stood side by side with her deputy, the sea monster Bridget. See Bridget? That's why we're here. The queen's face was a little cold, but her rectangular pupils shone with a strange colorful luster in the sun. The sea monster shook her head. We don't need the gratitude of these mortals, your majesty. After the battle of Ampere Seal, we don't owe these Erwin people anything. Is this all you see? The sea monster Bridget turned around and looked at her queen. For a long time, the people of the sea have been excluded from the circle of this world. Do you know why? The Frost Dew Queen replied, because we once missed the best opportunity to engrave the name of the Naga race on that sacred white stone tablet. She pointed to the distant sea and said, this is why we came here. We missed it once and we must not miss it a second time. In the sky the clouds were getting fewer and fewer. In a reception room in the city hall of Grey Harbor, Count Yanalasu and the Naga warrior Sani, who were sitting on the sofa, stopped talking at the same time, feeling something. In the hall outside it was already a mess. People rushed onto the street and looked south. Something had happened to Grenoirs. Someone was shouting. A bright pillar of light shone dazzlingly in the southern sky. In the ruins of the lighthouse, Freya looked up with a shocked expression. What is that? Brando, who was beside her, didn't say a word, vaguely guessing something. In the illusion, Amandina had no idea what was happening in Wonde. She looked at her with some confusion. My father? Martha nodded. She drew a picture with her hand. In the picture there was a bright room. The afternoon sun was shining into the room through the floor-to-ceiling arched windows. The silk curtains on one side were pulled open and fell to the ground, and the shadows just covered the bookshelves on the wall. At the desk, Viscount Borgnessen, who was obviously much more mature than he was 10 years ago, held a gray stone fragment excitedly and said to his knight colleague, "Old man, do you remember our conversation here last time? I think we're close to success. I already have the exact whereabouts of that stone fragment." The serious knight also had a few more deep wrinkles on his forehead than 10 years ago, and his temples were graying. He looked at his companion and said, "Shippard, I think the tree herders have noticed you." Viscount Nessen shrugged. "Of course. They're not stupid. They're just aware. I don't think I've exposed my identity yet." Amandina looked at the two people in the room in shock. She subconsciously took 2 steps forward and reached out to grab something, but her feet never stepped into the room. This is my family's manor in Aldrin. I recognize this place. This is the 2nd floor of the manor, my father's study. And who is he? How does he know my father's real name?" Amandina asked in surprise. Martha gestured for her to continue looking. Amandina bit her lips. She remembered something that happened 2 years before her father went missing. She was only 12 years old at that time. She remembered that there was a guest who took her father away, but she and her mother had gone to a nearby farm to be a guest. She couldn't help but have a complicated expression on her face. This study was exactly the same as in her memory. The glass windows of the cabinets were still filled with gray stone fragments of various sizes. After so many years, she still didn't understand what her father was looking for. Were those stone fragments really that important in his eyes? He was an adventurer. As his daughter, she could understand her father's love for his career. She could even understand the man's deep love for her and her mother. But what could he not tell them? After her mother passed away, she thought about this question all the time until she met Brando. Her father was not only the heir of House Cipher, but also the student and knight of the Earth Sword Saint. This was such a prominent identity, but he never told her and her mother. What? But if that was the case, why did he let her know the fate of House Cipher? Since he didn't intend to tell her the truth, then wouldn't it be better to let her be a naive noble lady? Tears blurred her vision at some point. Amandina used to think that she was strong enough and wouldn't cry easily no matter how much she faced. But the memories of the past were buried deep in her heart and did not fade with time. Instead, they became clearer and deeper. She took a step forward, hoping so much that she could ask the answer to this question herself. But time was so merciless that she didn't have a chance. Viscount Nessen stood up. "Pomed, we have to act now." The knight pondered for a moment. "Have you asked her opinion?" Viscount Nessen shook his head. "I can't find her. She left the royal family after adopting the baby girl. I don't know if she has been to Grenoir's, but the marshal has passed away for 2 years. Even if we know something, we have lost track of her. I've asked Scott, but he doesn't know either. I don't dare to look for the marshal's grandson, lest I bring him trouble. Old man, although the marshal is no longer around, it doesn't mean that our mission is over. You should still remember everything we saw in the illusion under Alkash. We have to stop the prophecy from happening. This time we have to do it ourselves." The knight nodded silently. "But what about your wife and daughter? Do they know about it?" Viscount Nessen was silent. There was obvious hesitation on his face. "It's not fair for you to do this." The Viscount shook his head. "Pomed, you know what we're doing. There's no fairness in this. Our companions have left one by one, but we're still here, aren't we?" He sighed slightly. "I do love them very much, but if I don't do it, it's not love. It's shirking responsibility. As a husband and a father, I have a reason to protect them, in my own way. I promised Sadie, do you remember? From the moment I gave her the wedding ring, I had to fulfill my promise." The knight looked at him. Viscount Nessen took a deep breath. "Just like the marshal entrusted us with, we have to make a decision. Do you understand, Pomed? I want to leave hope for my daughter and the world she lives in. Even if it costs me my life. I do love them very much, but if I don't do it, it's not love. It's shirking responsibility. I want to leave hope for my daughter and the world she lives in. Even if it costs me my life." Such a voice echoed in the clouds. In Bragg's, all the residents on every street stopped what they were doing and looked at the sky in astonishment. Some of them were locals who lived in Grey Rat Street. They had once been neighbors of Amandina's family. Their lives had not changed at all in the past 3 years. Even though Erwin had experienced a lot, to them, how much worse could their already poor lives get? Some people had come to Grey Rat Street and some had left. The rich had moved to the north during the Second War, while the poor could only continue to stay on this old and cramped street. However, many of them still remembered the family of 3 that used to live here, whose identity was completely different from theirs. Isn't that the voice of Viscount Nesson and Miss Amandina? I heard that Viscount Nesson went missing many years ago, and his daughter left Bragg's a few years ago. Miss Amandina is doing well now. I heard that she married Count Randner. That's hard to say. The situation in Erwin is so chaotic right now. Who knows what will happen in the south? I really hope that Lady Martha can protect the eldest princess. Sigh, it's really pitiful. Their family are all good people. Even though Viscount Nesson is a noble, he treats people with kindness and doesn't put on airs. In this world, good people are always unlucky. Who said otherwise? But what's with that voice in the sky? Didn't Viscount Nesson go missing for many years? Did you see that light? That's Kirkle, right? What happened in the north? Everyone was discussing. But no one noticed that behind the crowd, a cripple had dropped the sword in his hand. However, he didn't seem to notice it at all. He only looked at the blue sky with a pale face. In Silver Bay, a young mage stood on top of a hill, allowing the wind to blow his long hair. The mage listened to the 2 voices that he was once familiar with. He didn't know when, but his face was covered in tears. Did you do it? My companions. Amandina seemed to have seen that summer night again in her days. That night, the witch's back seat was especially bright in the southern sky. The stars were reflected on the water's surface, quietly flowing with the river Brags. Viscount Nesson watched his daughter return to the house, sighed, and turned his head back. In the silent Brugloss there were already lamps lit up in the dark night. Far away was Bunipan Avenue, and the noble district was like a star that fell to the ground. In a house far away, warm orange light shone through the window. The silhouettes of a family of 3 could be seen in the window. A husband and wife, a father and daughter. Their laughter seemed to come from the other side of the river. It was warm and real. He stood up with his hands on his knees and picked up a shovel from the corner of the wall. He dug a deep hole under a chestnut tree not far away. He crouched beside the hole and carefully buried a box. After doing all this, Viscount Nesson wiped his sweat and stood up. He looked at the new soil under the tree, his eyes full of tenderness. Annie, I'm sorry. I hope that one day you won't hate me because of this. I won't ask for your forgiveness, but there are some things in this world that we must do. It's not just because of the responsibility of House Cypher's bloodline to this kingdom. More importantly, there are many people around us who are worth protecting with our lives. Perhaps one day, my daughter, you will also meet such a person. He slowly took off the necklace from his chest and murmured, For Erwin, Lady Martha, please protect me. This is my last hope. Amandina was already sobbing when she saw this scene. Braggs and the street of the Grey Rat people were silent. No one understood what this scene meant. But for Brando, the scene in the Forbidden Orchard on Mount Butchie 3 years ago was still fresh in his mind. It was a father, a husband, a hero. The soundless skeleton could not tell him everything in the past, but the weathered parchment recorded the most sincere feelings. 2 people born in different eras. At that moment their fates intersected. Their gazes could not cross life and death, but their ideals and beliefs could still be transmitted. Freya bit her lips silently. The illusion was changing. It was in the sky, presenting the unknown story of the past in front of everyone. People saw with their own eyes that Viscount Nesson fulfilled his promise. He had snuck into the tree shepherds and obtained the grey stone, but Myad, the goo-worm lord, had discovered his identity. At the last moment, the knight Palmside sacrificed his life to pave the way for his companions. After a long chase and escape, Brando saw the place he was familiar with. Wasn't the golden demonic tree in the valley basin? Viscount Nesson hid in the depths of the crevice. The tree herders who could not find him planted the seed of the golden demonic tree in anger. And in the cave, the trembling father wrote the last letter of his life on a piece of parchment with a quill. Martha above, I may not be alive for long. If I die. Amandina covered her mouth. She still remembered the scene of that day. In the small and dim room there was a knock on the door. When she saw the young man's face through the crack of the door, her fate changed. But she clearly remembered how Brendel handed the letter to her at that time. The words on the letter were so clear in her memory as if it was yesterday. Big drops of tears rolled down the girl's cheeks and rolled into the dust. In many areas of Wonde, everyone stopped in their tracks, silently watching this moment. They saw Viscount Nesson use the last of his strength to pick up the gray stone piece and place it on the parchment. He seemed to want to write something, but the light of life in his blue-gray eyes was fading. The quill finally slipped from his hand and rolled into the gravel. It was the end of a hero. In the 10 cities, many people bowed to salute this scene. Although they could not really understand what this man was protecting, no matter where, the brave were always worthy of respect. Veronica slowly retracted her gaze and looked at Mephisto beside her. "I have seen this man's daughter," the Ash Sword Saint replied. "She is very outstanding and did not disappoint her father." "I know her," Veronica replied softly. Mephisto turned around and looked at the female commander with a puzzled expression. "Do you still remember the past?" Veronica asked. "The days when we learned swordsmanship together. At that time we were still very young." Mephisto could not help but be silent. Does he still remember the good times of the past? Of course. The illusion was still changing. In the dark palace, the great king had entered the moment of his death. The hero of the past, the Flame King Gretel, looked at his knight by his bedside. He suddenly remembered the most glorious moment of his life, but more than that, he was burdened with heavy responsibilities. But at the end of his life, the memory that appeared in the depths of his mind was still that unforgettable scene. He did not know how long it had been since he last dreamed of that place. The underground holy temple that changed their lives. In the darkness, the 4 sages stared at the stone walls of the holy temple. On those tall stone walls, there were all kinds of patterns drawn with strange patterns. The light of the torches flickered. A huge altar was reflected. On the obsidian platform, a human baby girl was sleeping in crystal amber. It seems that what Odin said is true. Eloranta stared at the patterns on the stone walls. This is the ancient language of Novin, the language of the divine people. The Azure Lance did not kill the Twilight Dragon. The 7th war may be coming soon. Then aren't we doing something wrong? Fanzin said loudly, "We have overthrown the rule of the Myurnas, so now what do we have to fight against the Twilight Dragon?" "Shut up, Farnazane." The blond young man's blue eyes glinted with wisdom. The sacred sword Odorfice shone in his hand. He spoke to his companions. "The Myurnas are already rotten. Their nobles are addicted to the glory of the past. What can Odin change? He chose us because he did not want to see the hope of this world die slowly. Since we have inherited this fate, we must bravely go on. I support Gretel." The young Saint Tassel was not as mature and sophisticated as she was later. The elven girl's face was pure and determined. "Sister Eloranta, do you see anything from this?" The Earth Sage turned around and nodded. "Gretel is right. We still have a chance." Although that chance was so illusory. The old man raised his trembling finger and pointed to the person he trusted most. The once proud young man, the chief of the Flame Knight, was now also old. Time was so cold and merciless. The king who had once created an empire was now speechless. But from his trembling movements, the old knight already understood everything. It was a tacit understanding of 2 centuries, and there was no need to repeat it with words. He nodded solemnly. That day Miss Rose came to the depths of the deadly frost forest, and a crystal stag witnessed a falling meteor in the magnificent night sky. 130 years after that, a country called Aween was founded. In a verdant valley. After a great battle, the knights celebrated their hard-won victory. But their king, the late King Eric, left everyone's sight alone. He came to the quiet lake, and another person was quietly waiting for his arrival on a rock by the lake. The late King Eric looked at the knight he trusted the most. "Have you made up your mind, Walter?" he asked. "From now on, you will lose your identity, your honor, and even your life. You may become the things you hate the most in your life. Your fate will forever be tied to this sword, and you won't be able to rest in peace. Until one day, when my descendants are no longer worthy of the sword's recognition, it will come here and quietly wait for its true master." The knight stood up silently. He didn't answer. But he had already knelt on one knee. The amber crystal on the altar shattered, and Princess Constance looked at the baby girl in her hand in shock. "Darius, the man with a serious face shook his head. "Don't worry about this, let's see what's written on the stone wall first." The female officer beside the princess named Gwendolyn looked at the two thoughtfully and answered, "That's the ancient language of Fenno, the language of the divine people. I just happen to understand the knowledge of this language in a book." "What's the content?" "The Dusk Dragon is about to awaken, but the mortals still have hope." "The Dusk Dragon?" Darius turned his head. So what we saw in the illusion was real. My lord, the monsters we encountered outside are called crystallizers, Gwendolyn replied. You saw their strength, but that's just the weakest branch of the crystallizers. They're just monsters formed on the basis of the original creatures of Wond, and the real crystallizers are unimaginably powerful, not to mention that the crystallizers themselves are not just a branch of the dusk species. So if the dusk dragon didn't die in the hands of the Azure Knight, then it's inevitable that it will make a comeback. Its claws and teeth are all over the various worlds in the chaos, and once they enter our world, it's enough to destroy everything. If that's the case, where's the hope of the mortals? Gwendolyn smiled slightly. Maybe it's here or maybe it's in Erewhon. It was the same sunny afternoon. The middle-aged Viscount Borgnessen smiled and said to his visiting companion, I've investigated clearly, the only hope Lady Martha left for our world is sleeping in Erewhon. At this time, Viscount Nessen still seemed to have no idea about his future fate. The knight looked at his companion. Do you still remember the prophecy we saw in Alcash Pomide? The knight nodded. The sword that changed fate. Viscount Nessen clenched his fists and showed an excited expression. Pomide, that's the throne of destiny, and the crystallizer that the tree herders have been searching for is the final guide to that hope. It's divided into 5 and is actually a beacon. It's the guidance Lady Martha gave us. Pomide, we must not let the hope of the world fall into the hands of those people. It's an ancient prophecy. Engraved on the Azure poem, 16. The TOWR the lost moon took away the light, XX. JUDMNT the light lost. 17. TSR the silver generation was lost on the earth, walking forward in the darkness and ignorance. 8. Esterings the coincidental meeting of the emperor and the fool. 9. TRMIT the rusty clockwork was being restored. XXI. TWRLD the sword that changed fate. Ember. Chapter 15:15. Marcia gently hugged Amandina, who was sobbing uncontrollably. She gently stroked her back and comforted her child. Amandina finally realized something and looked at Martha with tears in her eyes. You are Lady Martha? Martha nodded gently. You're back? The girl raised her head, her face was still covered in tears, and her voice was filled with eagerness. Will you help us fight against the Twilight Dragon? Martha smiled and shook her head. She gently wiped away Amandina's tears. My child, you don't need anyone's help. The tenacious will and confidence of mortals are your most powerful weapons. I have given you the power, and the rest is up to you to open up a magnificent future. Amandina looked at her in confusion, but she saw Martha gently touch her right hand. Starting from the tip of her finger, the goddess slowly turned into countless flying petals of light. In the dazzling light that was like the birth of a supernova, Amandina saw a quaint throne. And on the throne, there was a holy sword that was quietly sleeping. A gentle voice echoed throughout the sky of Wond. Children, don't give up hope. At that moment the whole world seemed to have stopped breathing. Everyone looked at the dazzling sword in the sky. In the elven palace in the deciduous forest of the White Mountain Range, the bell rang and the elven guards opened the door. The wind elves were the first to stand up, and one of them reached out to her opponent. Thank you very much, my name is Maria, the chief sorcerer of the elven court. The pale nobleman smiled and gracefully touched the elf's hand. Although at this moment your name and ours may be buried in the long river of history, but history will always remember this day. I believe that it is significant enough to change our future. Maria smiled. In any case, welcome back. Back to where? Maria smiled and did not answer, but the dark aristocrat from Madara did not pursue the matter. It was as if both of them had a tacit understanding. The envoys from both sides nodded to each other and slowly walked out of the hall. Then they stopped and looked up at the dazzling holy sword in the sky. No one said a word for a long time. South of Erewhon. A gust of wind blew through the Ansara forest. The forest rustled and countless dead leaves flew over people's heads. In the distance, the sparkling waves of the Bernichel River quietly passed through the southern lands of Anthony. The trebuchet creaked under the force of inertia as it launched the last stone projectile into Bernichel's walls in a parabola. After the flash of magic, the sound of buildings collapsing could be heard from within the city. The cultists had given up on resisting, and a fat dragon was spitting fire on the broken city wall, driving the people who had already collapsed to flee in all directions. The battlefield stopped. Everyone stared at the sky. Haruz held Micaiah's small hand and stared at the majestic mountain peak in the blue sky, the dazzling holy sword. His heart was in turmoil for a long time. Miss Amandina's father was also a hero. His unyielding spirit left everyone with the last glimmer of hope, so he was worthy of the title of knight. There were always many such heroes in the history of mankind. Haruz could not help but think of his teacher. In the dazzling light of the holy sword, he could always see a tall and straight back. Firm beliefs and ideals that would never fade. Was it not his teacher's words and deeds? Erwin's birth was so glorious, but could he bear the burden of his teacher's expectations? The little prince bit his lip and remained silent. Beside the two was the expressionless Duke Anthony. The Duke who had just experienced the pain of losing his son had gray hair, as if he had aged 10 years. He held his only granddaughter in his arms, the only bloodline left to him by his son and daughter-in-law. He stared at the sky for a long time without saying a word. The cultists slaughtered the people of Bernichel. This also filled their own graves with the last handful of soil. Bernichel did not take any prisoners. This was the order issued by the Duke. And from this day onwards, Anthony would also begin a great purge of all dissidents. Haruz knew that innocent people would die under this order, but he did not speak. Sometimes civilization needed iron and blood, and Erwin's decay had reached a point where his bones were visible. As a king he must learn to take responsibility. A man who wears a crown has no right to cherish his feathers. A country must move forward and someone must bear the stigma for it. Haruz was aware of this in his heart, but if someone had to pay the price for all these mistakes, it would not be Erwin's people but the Twilight Dragon. He clenched his fists. Behind him, Medusa Lysimachia was also shocked by the strange scene in the sky. Her reptilian prismatic eyes reflected the sword deeply, and her eyes flashed with hesitation and determination. It really exists, everything is real. Her friend, the sexy dark elf, grabbed her best friend's arm and looked at her worriedly. Lysimachia? Kaya's action alarmed Haruz in front of her. The little prince looked back and was startled to see Lysimachia's strange behavior. He thought Lysimachia was worried about him and hurriedly said, "Sister Lysimachia, you don't have to worry. This attack was unexpected and no one can blame anyone for it. Besides, I'm fine now, aren't I?" But he didn't expect that as soon as his voice fell, Lysimachia grabbed him with such force that he almost cried out in pain. His body's subconscious reaction was to use black magic to resist, but Haruz stopped the impulse because he saw the Medusa's eyes, clear and clear, without the slightest intention of hurting him. "Miss Lysimachia, you?" he whispered, gasping for breath. Micaiah also turned around, tilting her head and watching the scene with interest. She asked the little prince with her eyes if he wanted to help, but Haruz shook his head at her. Lysimachia lowered her head with a rare look of seriousness on her face. Looking at her best friend's expression, the dark elf Kaya seemed to realize something and quickly asked, "Lysimachia, have you thought about it?" Medusa looked back and nodded. "Kaya, we have lost our home. Do you want to experience the feeling of drifting again? We came to this world above ground to find hope. Now that we have reached the final moment, we must make up our minds." Kaya opened her mouth wanting to say something but stopped. "Kaya, do you trust me?" Lysimachia asked when she saw her expression. "Who else can I trust, Lysimachia? Without you I wouldn't be who I am now. I've always treated you like a sister," Kaya couldn't help but say. "When I gave it to you I trusted that you could make the right judgment." Lysimachia interrupted her. "Kaya, thank you, but it's time to stake everything." Kaya looked past Medusa, glanced at the sky with a complicated expression, and nodded. Haruz looked at the two of them with some surprise. "Miss Lysimachia, you—" Lysimachia pressed her finger to his lips and stopped him from continuing. "Haruz, my little prince, do you want to hear our story?" Haruz looked startled. Of course he knew that Lysimachia and Kaya's background was bizarre, but because of the kindness of Ampere Seal, he never had the idea of doubting Medusa. And it was because of his trust that Lysimachia had the idea of staying in this human kingdom. She looked at the little prince gently. "Kaya, she is of the Oath Keepers." General Phenoma withdrew his gaze from the sky and silently watched everything that was happening in front of him. Outside Ariel City on the plains of Corvado, two torrents, one black and one white, were converging. The dwarf King Caliphane was in the black torrent of the dwarven heavy cavalry, looking at the snow-white formation in the distance and muttering to himself, "They're here too." The White Lion Legion that was besieging Ariel was in the midst of their final counterattack. The human knights were in their final charging formation. A sea of purple crystals was surging towards them from the front. But the humans were shocked to see the army of their former enemies, the Lion Men of Toquinin, approaching them from the side and stopping side by side with them. The humans vaguely felt the intentions of the Toquinin, but they were still unable to be sure. Under the order, the knight who sent the order raised the flag of inquiry. A golden swallow-tailed flag, were they allies? The lion men hesitated for a moment, then raised a sacred white flag. On the flag, 7 sacred emblems fluttered in the wind. In response, they swore a sacred oath. General Phenoma stood on the remaining city wall and saw this scene. The sword in his hand fell to the ground with a clang. The horn was blown. The dwarven army had taken the lead, and the humans and the lion men did not hesitate. The night began to speed up, and the Corvado plains rumbled. The allied forces of the 3 races collided head-on with the sea of crystals like 3 hot knives cutting through butter. The dwarven heavy cavalry bore the brunt of the impact. Each of the dwarven heavy cavalry was like a moving fortress, and they were lined up side by side. Wherever they passed, there was a frenzy in the purple sea. Under the careful protection of Breton, Manrique, and the knight, Dilfrey followed the dwarven battle closely. "Miss Oathkeeper," the dwarf King Caliphan said to Dilfrey, who was standing in the middle of the night after smashing a crystal with his hammer. "Have you thought about where you intend to send the sacred sword after we win this battle?" Dilfrey looked at the dwarf king, and her eyes also fell on the sacred white flag. She held the long box in her hand a little tighter. However, a figure had already flashed through her mind and she nodded seriously. The sun shone down from the Balta Plateau, bringing with it the warmth of winter. When the captain of the inferior knight, Adams, who belonged to the 5th Legion of the White Lion Legion, woke up, he felt that he was being carried on someone's back. His mind replayed the chaotic memories before he fainted. Across the ruins of Ariel, the monsters that rushed towards his column like a tide, General Phenoma's order to defend the street, and his companions were getting fewer and fewer until he was the only one left. Facing the surrounding monsters, he only had the determination to fight bravely. Wasn't he supposed to be dead? Adams struggled to raise his head. He wanted to see who had saved him. Had General von Norma's strategy worked? Did the White Lion Legion take back the street? Did they win the final victory? Did they save Ariel City? How many casualties did they suffer? But what he saw was a long snow-white mane. The lion man turned back to look at the human on his shoulder. There was a long and narrow scar on his face, and his green eyes seemed to be embedded in the middle of the scar. The Lion Man of Toquinen. Adams was very familiar with one of the opponents of the White Lion Legion. Every winter there would be several clashes between the humans and the lion men. This hatred had lasted for hundreds of years and was deeply engraved in the bones of every sergeant of the White Lion Legion. It was the same for the lion men of Toquinen. But why were they here and why did they save him, their enemy? "You saved me?" "It's nothing," the lion man replied nonchalantly. He strode forward through the streets that had long since turned into ruins. "You can remember my name. My name is Cher. I will definitely become the greatest hero in the future." Adams could not help but look back at the boastful lion man, but he saw that the lion man's eyes were firmly fixed on the distant sky, and there was a dazzling light reflected in the depths of his eyes. There was a sword. "Don't be complacent too early, Martha." The Roman stood on a hill outside the lighthouse and sneered. Hundreds of miles away, the mercenary commander's eyelids suddenly twitched. Her movement startled everyone. "Someone, Miss Yuta, is awake." There was a panic. In the same panic, far away in the desert country of Rubik, far to the south of the continent of Vaunt, gravekeepers in gray robes were running towards the center of the temple in groups. Everyone had a solemn look on their faces, and the bells in the city were ringing. Adeline stood behind Naquil and looked at the main gate of the temple in disbelief. This was something that had never happened in 1,000 years. The great elder, accompanied by 12 gravekeepers, looked solemn. He held a blue short sword in his hand and came to the two of them. That is the sacred sword of wisdom?" Adeline stammered. Naquil nodded. "The ring of the world." The great druid of the ring of the sky opened the window and the wind blew in. Even in the harsh winter, the trade winds of the ring of the world could still bring back the scent of summer. A green leaf flew in through the window and landed on his hand. The great druid raised his sparse eyebrows and couldn't help but let out a bitter smile. "This little guy has given us a difficult problem. My lord? Go, let me see if it is that person." He looked back. Outside the window, the scenery of Atlanta was as beautiful as a painting. After the age of silver, do the Bugis still remember their glory and promise? As the guardians of the Truth Parliament, the guardians of the knowledge of the Great Library, and the descendants of the wise ancestors, do the Bugis who have the blood of silver pursue power or wisdom? What was engraved on the towering white spire? Was it the truth of laws or the judgment of destruction? The mystery of the universe that everyone once explored in almost infinite lives, is it just the ravaging and trampling of the weak, or the persistence of true knowledge? I believe that the Bugas are wise because no matter how the pros and cons are weighed, how the gains and losses are chosen, what can make the Silver people more glorious is always knowledge and truth, not strength and power. I believe that the wise have a long-term vision and can cut through the heavy fog and see the true future of the City of Silver. I believe in civilization, not barbarism. Just as I believe that wisdom will eventually defeat greed, I believe that the people of the clouds can make themselves make a decision that they will never regret, because I believe that we still have a glorious future. And this is what I want to say, all of it. Kaneki, in the Cloud Temple, the Prime Minister's daughter in a white robe gently threw away the script in her hand, raised her head, and looked at the thousands of silver people on the circular staircase venue. There was complete silence. Solomon stood next to Delphian with his eyebrows down, his expression calm. He looked up at his colleagues, burning with the flame of wisdom in his eyes that saw through everything. He appeared very calm. Let's vote. Thousands of hands were raised, no one opposed, no one abstained. Lady Tanya the fairy stood on Phoenix's shoulder, her silver eyes looking at the somewhat calm and somewhat proud human girl with some shock. Then there was a storm of applause sweeping through the audience. The year of the sword, the first day of the month of the winter harp. The Bugas announced a break with the Sarsadrians. The wizard war had just begun, and it was nearing its end. When Amandina woke up, she already felt the warm and familiar embrace. She raised her head weakly and looked at the familiar face, and Miss Freya's somewhat complicated expression. She hurriedly struggled, but could not break free from Brando's embrace. Her face was a little red. "My lord? What's wrong with me?" Brando looked at the silver pattern on his Lady Aid's right hand, and answered word by word, "You saved everything, Amanina." Chapter 15-16. The wind blew across the silver sand dunes and the gravel was lifted up. In the sky, the clouds were gradually gathering again. Brando seemed to remember something and handed the weak Amandina in his arms to Freya. "Wait for me." Freya nodded silently. Brando turned around and stepped on the sand to Wizard Sader's side. The once famous wizard leader was now disheveled, and he was no longer as majestic as he used to be. He bent his body and lowered his head, staring blankly at the sand until Brando's boots appeared in his field of vision. Only then did he raise his trembling head and stare straight at the young lord. He opened his mouth and said in a hoarse voice, "You must be very proud, human." Brando looked at the man's cloudy eyes. His silver pupils were bloodshot, like an old and dying beast. He did not even feel angry in his heart at the moment. He only replied faintly, "This is the choice of the people of Sasald. Does it feel good to be a traitor?" Wizard Sader made a gurgling sound in his throat and laughed coldly. "So what? You are not immortal." Brando looked at him and could not help but show a trace of sadness in his eyes. "Don't you understand? If we think we are, then we are one of the majority of people in this land," he said quietly, "because there are no transcendents in this world. Even Mother Marcia never thought that she could be high and mighty. The truly pitiful ones are those who cut themselves off from the rest of the world. Sader, there is no such thing as being born noble in this world, and blood cannot be a barrier between people. What Lady Martha gave you was not power but responsibility. Unfortunately, you don't understand." He slowly opened his arms as if he was embracing the wind and said softly, "Why are we proud? I am a mortal, a member of this tiny kingdom. I am the Lord of Tanajal. This insignificant identity, but I cherish it very much. Why am I proud? It is not the power I was born with, but the trust people have in me. It is the connection and promise between people. It is all the precious feelings in this mortal world. We are proud because we dare to protect all the beautiful things. This kind of pride." Brando looked at Sader and replied with a heavy heart, "You don't understand." Sorcerer Sader screamed. His decaying body struggled and lunged over, but he fell heavily onto the sand dune. He used all his strength to grab the sand as if he wanted to crush it. Unfortunately, he could only watch helplessly as the sand slipped through his fingers. He fell on the sand dune and let out a howl like an injured beast. Brando looked at him coldly. "Isn't it easy to be mesmerized when my lord looks like this?" Amandina said softly as she looked at his back. Freya was caught off guard by this question, but she was too embarrassed to try to cover it up, so she could only nod her head frantically. Amandina looked at her with an amused expression. "Erwin is so small, Freya. So small that Mr. Brando can disdain its throne." But it's so big that he can't let go of everyone here," she said meaningfully. Freya responded with a and, and. "Freya, other than the Roman lady, you are the first to know, my lord." Amandina continued softly, "Although there are some things that I don't want to say, everyone can see it. If one day one of us is unable to return from the battlefield, will you regret your thoughts at this moment?" Freya was stunned. She looked at Brando's back in the distance with a complicated expression. "Amandina, you don't have to tell me," Amandina said. With that, she turned her head and gently bit her lip. Freya's voice was like a mosquito's buzzing. "Miss Amandina, I look really that obvious?" Amandina's eyes widened. She turned around and looked at the hopeless ostrich. After a while, she finally couldn't help but cover her mouth and burst out laughing. Degenerate. Wizard Sodder lay on the sand dune, his voice like a candle in the wind. Brando took one last look at the sad guy and turned to leave. But the King of Wizards seemed to have a final burst of strength. His whole body trembled violently and he shouted with all his strength behind him, "Vladimir the Great will not let you go." Brando stopped and didn't look back. What a coincidence, me too. Adept Sodder's final expression was one of shock and astonishment. He made a cracking sound in his throat and reached out as if he wanted to grab something, but his body's functions had long been lost along with his magic power. His head tilted slightly, and his whole body lost its vitality like a piece of dead wood. The wind and sand rose, and the corpse of the Sasaldian wizard leader disintegrated like a weathered object, turning into sand and disappearing with the wind. Freya supported Amandina as they walked over. "What's wrong with you?" Brando looked at her face, which was a little too red. "No, nothing." The Erewhon Valkyrie hurriedly changed the topic in a panic. "Brando, are we going to war with the Sasaldians again?" "It's me," Brando replied casually. "The wizard war is over. Erewhon shouldn't be involved in this war anymore, but there are still some debts I have to collect. Prince Levin's death, and his wife's death, everything must be accounted for." The burning giant ship was like a torch falling from the sky, and the steel was distorted and let out a wail similar to that of a giant beast. Woo! The people watched this tragic scene. The flames lit up the sky and reflected on everyone's faces. Although the small airships around the Flash tried their best to save some people, the 300 soldiers on the ship were destined to spill their blood on this foreign land. It slowly fell to the ground, and everyone solemnly saluted in that direction. In the flames, the heroic spirits became eternal. The Flash sent the last signal, indicating that we should continue forward. The soldier who gave the order held the note with red eyes and for a moment, did not know whether to continue reading. The old man waved his hand, leaned on his cane and left without a word. The night was silent behind him. Many people knew that the person on the ship was the old man's eldest son. The people had lost too much, so much so that they had lost the right to grieve. The sky was already in chaos. The formation of the floating warships was intertwined with each other, and all kinds of emergency airships made the airspace even more chaotic. In the sky, there were flying beetles and screaming dragons, and dragons of different colors were fighting each other. The light of magic penetrated the entire battlefield from time to time, and various colors of light and smoke intersected in the sky. Burning fireballs whimpered as they fell from the sky, and finally turned into a dazzling ball of fire that hit the ground. The corpses of the dusk species fell like rain. 2 injured dragons were forced to leave the formation and began to make a forced landing in the direction of Canterbell City. "Quick, cover them." On the warships, all kinds of sharp alarms were blaring. The knight shouted loudly, even suppressing the hoarse voice of the messenger. "There's a high-intensity magic reaction in front. Full rudder left, evasive maneuver. Subfleet, change formation. Watch the clouds, they're coming down." The beetles formed a huge arrowhead and flew down from the clouds. The cruise fleet was in a panic, and the limited counterattack could not cause fatal damage to these monsters. Just as the tragedy was about to happen, a cloud was suddenly torn apart, and a huge silver dragon pounced from the right, smashing the beetles' formation into pieces. With a swing of her tail, Flora swept away countless beetles, and then spread her wings to split them in half. She turned around in the air and then had the leisure to signal to the cruise fleet. The appearance of this elegant creature immediately caused the entire fleet to cheer. Everyone raised their hands and excitedly waved the weapons in their hands. The captains and first officers on the warships saw this scene, and their hearts were filled with excitement. It was as if they had returned to the War of the Holy Saints 1,000 years ago. The battle had entered a white-hot stage. A sub-fleet of the Hazel suddenly broke away from the main fleet's formation, and launched a radical arrow formation towards the center of the battlefield. Their target was the huge black ball of light in the clouds, the source of the Battle of Canebell. The crazy actions of this fleet immediately triggered the situation of the entire battlefield. Everyone stopped, and many knights rushed to the side of the ship and looked at the scene in shock. The black ball obviously felt threatened. The Dusk army in the air began to gather in this direction under its command, and surrounded the fleet. Alaz was the first to react. "Stop them." The little female dragon's majestic voice resounded through the sky. Under her command, the dragons turned and climbed in order to seize a higher airspace. They needed to use swooping to divide and surround the beetles, which was the dragon's best tactic in the sky. The humans also reacted. Buy time for them. Sir Armand raised the cane in his hand, and the flagship cruise was the first to turn, and then everyone saw the flag change formation. All main warships entered the battle line. The entire fleet exposed its side at the most dangerous moment, and released a group of Pegasus Knights. The cruise knights raised their spears and roared as they rushed towards the flying beetles. For cruise. The command was given. On the side of the ship, the Flintlock Regiment had already set up a long dragon spear, and the filling crew finished filling it in a few seconds. The flag bearer waved his hand, and a row of white smoke rose from the side of the cruise ship. The flying horseshoe beetles seemed to have crashed into a wall, and the first few rows fell down like rain. On the ground, the forced landing of the two dragons caused a commotion. Everyone in the Silver Bay Coalition army was in awe of this battle, and they knew that this would be a war that would determine the fate of the entire world. Everyone silently prayed for their compatriots, praying for the fleet and dragons that came out of nowhere. The attack of the crystal clusters on the ground temporarily stopped, and more crystal clusters were spreading their crystal wings and flying into the sky. Many people spontaneously ran to the top of the city wall and looked at the sky. They clenched their weapons in their hands and wished that they could join the battle themselves. But the commanders of the coalition army had not given the order yet. The old white sword St. Brant saw the two injured dragons that were forced to land, and suddenly grabbed his coat from his attendant, carried his sword, and turned to leave the city wall. Little Duke Malvis was stunned when he saw this. "Uncle Brant, where are you going?" Brant did not turn his head. "Time's up to fight." Duke Malvis was stunned. But suddenly he made up his mind and quickly caught up. "Uncle Brant, count me in." Brant turned his head and glanced at this guy. "You will die." Little Duke Malvis gestured with his hand on his chest. "I know." Brant then nodded approvingly. "That's more like it." The two of them walked down the horse path. Under the city wall, the soldiers looked up at their commander, and their expectant eyes said everything. Amidst the creaking of the capstan, the heavy city gate slowly opened. The human knight was already in formation under the city wall, and the young knight looked at the purple crystal sea in the distance with a solemn expression. They took a deep breath, and their pupils of different colors were all filled with nervousness. Brant stood beside these young people and pointed his sword forward. "Get ready." The knight pulled down their metal masks and the white mist condensed into frost on the metal. The first and second rows began to jog faster and passed by the suspension bridge. The spears were like a forest and the banners were like the sea. Brant turned his head back on his horse and saw that his granddaughter had already climbed to the top of the city wall. The nun princess's expression was cold as she stared at the crystal cluster sea in the distance. The two dragons had already fallen to the hills in the north, and the crystal clusters flew in that direction in an overwhelming manner. She raised her hand, and the Book of Gaia had been released from its restraints and was surrounding her. The pages of the book were flipping. A huge magic circle appeared above the girl's head. The crystal clusters noticed the movement in this direction, and a few of the long-range crystal clusters immediately began to divert their firepower. However, the stray arrows that flew past Magadol were also blocked by a pale yellow light net. The girl's voice was clear as she spoke. Chapter 7 Creation. She raised her hands and in a loud roar stone pillars that were tens of meters wide rose from the ground. The knight was jogging faster, and these stone steps were like waves that carried them forward steadily, as if a bridge had been raised in the purple crystal sea. All the crystal clusters that rushed towards the bridge were immediately crushed by a bright yellow crystal storm. All the soldiers on the city wall were stunned. Then there was a burst of cheers. In the sky, the two commanders looked at the scene on the ground and nodded at the same time. Their colleagues below were not simple. The Silver Bay Coalition Army's actions at this time were just right when the Twilight Army was about to move. Even they felt uncomfortable watching it, let alone the other party. Now that the Crystal Cluster army could not take care of the front and rear, in a sense, this greatly reduced the pressure on them. In this case, of course, they would not waste the wonderful assistance of the Silver Bay Coalition army. On the battlefield, the Hazel's subfleet was close to its limit. The Hazel people sent out their last signal flag. The flag had no meaning, it was just a salute to their colleagues. Everyone was quiet. It was a flag that symbolized wisdom and courage. The two commanders took off their hats, held them in their hands, and saluted in the direction of the flag. The giant dragon swooped down, splitting the swarm of Zergs on the battlefield into two, so that they could no longer catch up with the Hazel people's fleet. The main fleet of the Cruise people and the Hazel people were firing round after round, and the bullet screen did not stop for a moment. The battlefield seemed to have stopped at this moment. The small fleet released their last air knight. The knight piloting the mech rushed into the swarm of Zergs in front with fearless courage. Then there was a dazzling flash, explosion and shockwaves as if countless suns were lit up in the sky at the same time. Everyone raised their heads. They watched as the fleet tore through the opening and went straight into the black ball in the clouds. A signal was transmitted to the entire fleet at the same time. A bigger explosion was produced. At that moment, it was as if the whole world had darkened, and only a bright ball of light was left in everyone's eyes. The ball of light suddenly shot out in all directions, and the dazzling white light shrouded everything. The huge roar caused everyone on the battlefield to experience tinnitus and deafness for a short period of time. Thus, this white and flawless world seemed to have quieted down. The shockwave swept through everything in an instant. The closest Zergs were directly vaporized into ashes. The airflow affected the giant dragons, forcing them to scatter their formation, not to mention the human fleet. The airflow almost knocked everyone off their feet. But people quickly got up from the deck and looked in the direction of the black ball. Then everyone sucked in a breath of cold air. Above the huge black ball in the sky there was a huge head. A metal dragon. Across the world, the city of Candlebell was as small as a speck of dust in front of it. Its indifferent silver eyes looked at the world, half of its body was exposed outside the black ball, and only half of its wings had not been stretched out in the ball. It was obvious that the life-risking attack had interrupted its teleportation process. Looking at the metal dragon, the dragons were silent. Allah's heart was filled with complicated feelings. Once upon a time, it was the dragon's faith and pride, the dragon god Bahamut. But at this moment they had to bid farewell to their past. The little female dragon suppressed the grief in her heart and shouted, "We can't let the sacrifice go to waste before it comes out, let's form a formation, there's only one chance. Listen to my command, dragons. Supreme Circle Magic, Dragon Strike." The dazzling light pierced through the sky. Chapter 15-17. String Magic. These three words represented the most destructive power since the era of the gods. The incantation system based on the dragon language bypassed the restless elemental layer and the silver-white law network, directly extracting power from the lowest level of the Tiamat code. The three elements that made it up, the law, energy, and matter, were the foundation of the construction of this world. With the string of law, it reshaped the purity of energy and magic. This was the origin of the name of string magic. The pinnacle of mortal spells was the 14-circle spell. The silver folk called it a forbidden spell because that was the limit that the law and elemental power could reach. But for the gods, this kind of power was just a secondary manifestation of the essence of this world. What was the universe? It was dimension and energy. Only string magic had the 15th circle, the spell used in the War of Gods. Even in the past countless eras, the brilliant god-slaying sword didn't have the opportunity to be used every time. In this declining era, there was only one race left on this continent that used string magic, the dragons. And after the War of the Holy Saints, in fact, the dragons could no longer use the ring ritual to recreate the glory of the past. But there was always a turning point. That was to use the power of life. A huge magic array unfolded behind more than 100 dragons. The chanting of the incantation resounded between heaven and earth, the air resonated, and a bright beam of light pierced through the magic array. Even though it crossed a distance of tens of thousands of meters, it was still like a spear of light, accurately piercing into Bahamut's head. The light was so simple and unadorned that the cruise people who were close at hand couldn't even detect any energy fluctuations in this spell. But when the human wizards on the ship saw this scene, they almost went crazy. Their understanding of this world told them that any magic would weaken, and no form of energy could transition between different energy forms without energy loss. But this dazzling beam of light, It was a perfect form of energy with zero dissipation rate. This was magic that couldn't exist. But it was displayed in the modern world by the string magic of the dragons. Everyone watched in shock as the beam of light pierced through the metal dragon's head. Bahamut howled in pain, raised his neck, and his whole body stood up from the black sphere and fell backward. However, this did not come without a price. The dragons in the formation were turning into dust one by one and were blown away by the wind. Prepare for the second attack. Alaz looked at the sacrifice of her own kind and felt like her heart was being cut by a knife, but she steeled her heart. For victory, even she could give up her own life. She reminded her companions loudly, "Don't put your hopes on one attack, our goal is to stop it from coming to this world." Alaz? Flora looked at her worriedly. "I'm fine." The little female dragon shook her head vigorously. The formation lit up once again and the second attack was charging up. However, the screams interrupted everyone's movements. Everyone looked below. Alaz lowered her head. An inconceivable scene was reflected in the golden pupils. The black sphere was shrinking. And Bahamut? Everyone was stunned. The metal dragon had disappeared. In the dark and deep space, the remaining starlight was still half extinguished, emitting a small amount of light. The remains from the Age of the Gods floated quietly in this space. The surface was covered with a faint layer of starlight. At the end of the vision, the crystal wall divided the entire space into two. One side was the deep void and the other side was Won's fluorescent atmosphere. On the ground, many places were flashing with sparks of fire. The crystal wall was full of cracks and from time to time, small pieces fell from the wall with a slight noise, floating in the space. In the distance, rows of constructs were distributed in the vast sky, shining with a metallic luster. A shrill scream filled with hatred and resentment suddenly shook the entire space. The floating remains were pushed back by the sound wave, colliding with each other. One of the metal dragons suddenly retreated and crashed into the building. One side of its metal face, from its eye socket to its jaw, had completely disappeared, leaving only a pitch-black hole. It screamed in pain and rolled around, spreading its platinum wings and crushing countless constructs into smithereens. It was so furious that it turned around and was about to pounce on the space crack again. But at this time, a cold snort came from the darkness. "Bahamut, I didn't expect that you and I would exchange identities in this war." This voice stopped Bahamut's movement. It turned its huge head slowly in that direction and saw a giant wolf, standing like a mountain, step by step in the void and came to a place not far from it. Ekis raised his head and looked at the scene coldly. "Rebel, rebel." Bahamut let out a series of low growls. "Die." It turned around, spread its wings and pounced on Ekis. But Ekis only needed to move slightly to the side to avoid its attack. Her eyes flashed with a strange light, looking at her old enemy. "Lord Twilight Dragon, is it fun for you to control these broken toys?" As she spoke, she raised her claws and slapped the metal dragon's back, sweeping it away. With a loud noise, Bahamut crashed into the crystal wall in the distance like a meteor. The crystal wall, which was clearly cracked everywhere, didn't tremble in the slightest when the metal dragon crashed into it. Not even a trace of crystal powder fell from the wall. The dragon crawled up shakily. But how could Ekis give it the chance? She leaped over and stepped on the fallen dragon god. Amidst the cracking sounds, the platinum dragon was stomped onto the crystal wall. The dragon let out a low roar of anger. Ekis understood that the Twilight Dragons had already left this body, and now this fallen dragon god was only fighting based on instinct. She snorted coldly, "Without Tiamat's law, it seems that you don't even have a brain. Without Martha's support, how are you going to fight me?" The metal dragon couldn't understand her words at all and struggled frantically. Ekis raised her head, and the silver hair on the back of her neck stood up. She stood on Bahamut's body without moving an inch. She even squinted her long and narrow eyes, appearing somewhat enchanting as she sneered, "Still struggling? Your brain really isn't clear anymore. You were interrupted in the process of descending, and even suffered a dragon strike. If it were me, I wouldn't feel good, let alone a piece of trash like you." As she spoke, she mercilessly slashed down with her claws. The power of this claw was so great that even the space under the sharp claws produced layers of ripples. This claw slashed heavily on Bahamut's neck. Although it didn't break through the power of law, it still made it let out a painful howl. Ekis was unmoved and bit down like a real beast. The metal dragon's voice suddenly changed from a roar at the beginning to a low cry of pleading. But gradually, even the sound of the wailing gradually became softer. Ekis' claws stepped on its shoulders, and the sharp teeth that could destroy everything finally pierced through the layers of power of law, and bit down on the dragon god's neck. With a soft crack, Bahamut's massive body shuddered. His only remaining mercury eyeball flickered for a moment before finally dimming. That was the last moment of a god. Although it was somewhat ironic, in this war, the two sides that originally represented order and chaos had now switched positions. Looks like order has won again, Ekis said to herself somewhat sarcastically. After confirming that her opponent was completely dead, she raised her head and let out a long howl from afar. After several eras she finally killed this damn reptile. But it represented Martha. Thinking of this, Ekis turned back and looked at the woman wrapped in a black robe in the distance. Sophie stood on a floating ice crystal asteroid, calmly watching the war. A war between gods, but it was so barbaric and violent, and lacked the beauty it should have. But in fact, when one's power exceeded a certain level, the battle actually became simple and direct. Ekis let go of Bahamut's body, and the huge metal body slowly flew out. It could be foreseen that in the next few hundred years, this wreckage would soon become a part of this silent space. Another god slumbered in the world. I have already proven my sincerity. Although I could have not killed it after rebooting this world, it should have been a part of me, Ekis said. So, Little Witch, now it's your turn to fulfill your promise. Sophie nodded. Yes, she answered, her voice unchanged. The girl raised her head, and her gaze passed over the giant wolf that was like a mountain range, and looked at the distant wound. In the darkness, rows of constructs were suspended in the starry sky, their edges emitting a faint light. She raised a finger and made a symbol. That was the Eye of Truth of the Inquisition. Then there was the Ouroboros of the Inquisition. The World Tree. The Dragon of War Tiamat. Sophie's pupils flowed with green light, and rows of data fell in her eyes like a waterfall. As she drew symbols that represented authority from near to far, the rows of constructs in the starry sky lit up. Ekis closed his eyes. She sighed in a low voice, sure enough, this is the entirety of the law of Tiamat. I have to say that you are really smart to be able to build such a huge system. Then, after they all belong to me, can I restart this world? No. Sophie shook her head. Ekis suddenly opened her eyes and her gaze was terrifyingly cold. Why, are you going back on your word? Our agreement is that you can only restart this world when everyone has given up hope, Sophie replied in a manner that was neither servile nor overbearing. I don't object to you taking over the authority of Tiamat. For the new world, it doesn't matter who the mother is. But at least in this era you have to abide by our agreement. And if I don't agree? Ekis asked in return. You don't have the authority, Sophie looked at her quietly. You won't get the throne of destiny until the very last moment. Ekis bared her snow-white teeth, and her eyes flashed with a dangerous light, but Sophie raised her head and looked at her fearlessly. Very well, I will abide by the agreement. Sophie nodded. But there is one more question, Ekis said. What question? I'm very curious, who are you? Ekis narrowed her long and narrow eyes dangerously. You said you are the inheritor of the 13th moon, but I have never heard of a witch's inheritance with a higher authority than the Witch Queen. Is this important? Of course, this concerns my judgment of your goodwill. Sophie thought for a moment and replied, You have also never heard of the existence of an inheritor of the 13th moon, Ekis. Ekis was silent. Sophie then continued softly, Actually, I am the third experiment subject. The third experiment subject? In the curved surface plan, Miss Roman represents the path of coexistence with the dusk, and I represent the path of complete suppression of the chaos magic. Complete suppression, Ekis sneered. What about the young man named Brando? The three plans were only to ensure the comprehensiveness of the plan, but Sophie did not argue with her and only replied, He is different from us, only Lady Martha knows about that. This answer made Ekis frown and ask, Even you don't know? Yes, Sophie nodded again. Miss Roman is a product of the truth theory, I am a product of the judgment union, only Mr. Brando comes from the will of Gaia. Gaia's will has always been the most mysterious existence among the various organizations of the gods, and only Martha has all the authority. But I am Martha now. You are not. Ekis took a deep breath. Speaking of which, I thought of another thing. Where are the 47 psionic mechanical satellites of Gaia? Why didn't I feel it just now? Have you forgotten? Sophie calmly replied, That is the agreement between you and Miss Tiamas, I am not responsible for interfering. So that is an immortal object. She actually wants to use such a great existence to revive a mortal. I really can't understand your stupidity, Ekis coldly snorted. It doesn't matter, I can wait, but you better not play any tricks. Sophie was unmoved by her threat. Ekis was also somewhat helpless against this human girl. After giving her a deep look, she turned and disappeared into the darkness. Behind Sophie stood Ekis' other daughters, or to be exact, there were 4, the Kohua sisters, standing hand in hand. The 2 sisters stood side by side, one dressed in black and the other in white, as if they were carved out of the same mold, except that one was cold as ice, while the other was quiet and gentle. Behind them was Agatha, dressed in black mourning clothes with a black veil on her head. She looked like a woman living in seclusion, but her face was as calm as water, as if she did not care about anything. Ekis' youngest daughter stood at the back of everyone, still naked. Her snow-white bare feet stepped on the metal surface, and she wrapped herself with a large silver-white tail. She tilted her head and smiled, revealing her small fangs, occasionally moving her long silver ears. She looked more like a fox than a wolf. She looked left and right with a curious expression, and finally whispered to Dark Kohua, "Sister Kohua, why does Mother look unhappy?" Dark Kohua coldly snorted, ignoring it. The black sphere had completely disappeared. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, the sky outside Canterbell had returned to its clear and boundless sky. The crystal clusters were receding like the tide, and the locusts and giant dragons had also lost their target, running amok in the human fleet, but without an orderly command, their destruction was only a matter of time. On the ground, the exhausted Silver Bay Coalition army could no longer give chase. Many people sat on the ground, paralyzed, looking at the disappearing pillar of light in the southern sky. They already knew that it was Erewhon. That was where the hope of civilization lay. The huge fleet in the sky slowly changed its formation, and more floating battleships began to leave their original formation, joining the ranks of the pursuers. The people who had survived the disaster looked at the scene in front of them in a daze. Young Duke Malvis knelt on the ground with a pale face, and a giant dragon girl with bright eyebrows and bright eyes was bandaging his wounds, giggling from time to time. Blank turned his head back from a distant hill, and could not help but shake his head at the sight of young Malvis. He was here to save someone, but in the end, he was saved by the person he was supposed to save. How embarrassing. But most of the night did not think so. Most of these warriors, who were covered in blood, looked at their duke with reverence and even a little envy. The cheers from the direction of Canterbell City could be heard from afar. When the cheers sounded like a tsunami, everyone here realized that they had won. Yes. Victory. Magadal stood on the city wall, covered her mouth, and tears rolled down her cheeks. Many people were crying. They were happy for the desperate situation, sad for the friends who died in the battle, and happy for the future that was saved. Those were tears of excitement and sorrow. Their cries echoed in the wind. Look, this was the victory of the mortals. The sword that changed fate was always held tightly in the hands of everyone. The spirit of never giving in was the flame of civilization. Allah spread her wings, and let the shadow of the giant dragon sweep across the land, patrolling the entire battlefield in the sky. But her emotions were a little messy, and her face was slightly pale. Some of the closely connected things in her bloodline told her one thing a few minutes ago. Bahamut was dead. The era of the Golden Folk was over. P.S. Although it is not necessary, but after thinking about it, I still want to ask for monthly votes. After all, this should be the last time I ask for monthly votes for this book. That you're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.